looking into some of those governing documents, having some discussions about your administration structure, kind of all that fun government things. Thinking back about kind of the journey we've been on so far, we had workshop 1 where we had Auntie Marlene come in and talk about kind of our traditional values, really as the groundwork for a lot of the work that we're doing together. And then thinking too about nation rebuilding in our second workshop. So here we learned about creating and recreating systems that work for your nation and your people. And so we really have to be able to trust that we have the people to do this work to make these capable governing institutions. And so we always like to kind of start off with a quote. Here we have one from Wilma Mankiller of the Cherokee Nation. She says that I think it's the most important issue we have as a people is what we started, and that is to begin to trust our own thinking again and believe in ourselves enough to think that we can articulate our own version of the future and then work to make sure that that vision becomes a reality. And so that's a lot of what colonialism did, was kind of take away our belief in ourselves as a people, as individuals. And so something we've been working to regain is regain that cultural pride, regain that trust in ourselves that we can make decisions for our people and lead in a good way. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Michelle to give a little bit of an overview of what we'll be covering today.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Michaela kind of mentioned where we're at in the workshop series, but we'll just go ahead and remind you all and refresh where we're at. So today we're in the third workshop in this series, and it's been a great journey so far. Like Michaela mentioned, we started off this series reflecting on Indigenous leadership and governance and heard from Auntie Marlene, who shared some powerful teachings and reminders with us. Then in workshop 2, we learned about the Native Nation rebuilding principles and shared some cool examples from other Native nations and talked about how the principles are being embodied in so much of the work that you all are already doing today. So today we're going to gain a deeper understanding of Lower Brule history and governance. And I'll go over our agenda on the next slide so that you have an idea of what to expect for today. You all should have gotten a copy of the agenda in your email. So I'll just briefly go over what today will look like. Of course, we always start with our welcome and overview. And then next, we'll go into some learnings and reflections from our last session and some of those resources that we gave you all to look over. Then we'll do a very brief overview of federal Indian policy and its impacts. And we'll take a look at your constitution, organizational structure, roles and responsibilities. And then we'll take a break for lunch at noon and return back at 12:30. Then we'll look at applying the Native Nation rebuilding principles in tribal governance. We went over these during our last workshop, and today we'll get a chance to see how they can really be applied in your day-to-day work. We'll look at examples of tribal constitution reform, as well as examine how the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation organizes their government structure. We'll wrap up group discussion about your nation's constitution, bylaws, overall governance structure and systems, and identify your strengths, challenges, and opportunities for the future. Then at the end of the day, we'll go into our reflections and wrap up, and then we'll close at 2 p.m. Are there any questions about what we'll be covering today? All right, well, I'll go ahead and pass it back to Michaela for our learnings and reflections.
All right, so as always, we want to kind of refresh what we spoke about last time, which again was those rebuilding Native nations principles. And so we have a short video that we'll play here that kind of gives a brief overview for a refresher on what those principles are.
What is Native Nation rebuilding? Picture this. Young people laughing as they play a game in their language. Tribal leaders attending the grand opening of a new Indigenous Wellness Center. Entrepreneurs hosting a pop-up event featuring Native-owned businesses. These all sound like hallmarks of a successful Native nation, right? Now, envision a different scenario. A tribal department head selecting his uncle for the job instead of the most qualified candidate. Elders not receiving the culturally specific health resources they need. A tribal council ousting their chairman due to allegations of theft. This nation sounds like it has some issues to resolve. You've likely heard real-life versions of many of these examples, And you've probably noticed that some Native nations are more successful than others. But have you ever stopped to truly consider why? This question inspired the researchers from the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development, who originally created the Native Nation Rebuilding Framework. They analyzed a huge volume of data and case studies, eventually pinpointing 5 specific factors that lead to Native nations thriving on their own terms. The Rebuilding Framework provides guidance for both internal governance and external relationships through 5 interconnected principles. In order for Native nations to see results, the principles all need to exist at the same time. Let's explore the principles themselves and what they mean. Up first is transformational leadership. This means a nation's leaders serve as visionaries, change makers, and mobilizers. Next is strong governing institutions. Essentially, this looks like a nation having systems, laws, and policies that are effective, clear, and fair. Nations with strong governing institutions also have mechanisms for adjusting systems that aren't working. We must consider the future, and that's where 7th generation thinking comes into play. This principle says that a nation's decision-making is strategic and long-term. Culture lies at the heart of who we are. The principle of cultural match is defined by the creation of systems that reflect Indigenous culture and values. And lastly, we can't forget about sovereignty, or a nation's ability to design and create its own future. You might be wondering, why is this framework referred to as rebuilding? The term rebuilding honors the fact that Native people and nations already have the tools they need to succeed. The rebuilding framework simply puts these tools into a common language. At its core, rebuilding is about using Indigenous knowledge and values to solve modern-day problems in a way that makes sense to that particular nation. One important note before we go, it's essential to differentiate between Native nation rebuilding approach and the standard approach. The standard approach refers to an unstrategic, unempowered, rushed, and oftentimes unfair way of solving problems. Think back to the example we gave earlier about the tribal department head who chose his uncle for the job instead of the most qualified candidate. This is a perfect example of the standard approach. Alternatively, using the Native nation rebuilding approach here would look like a nation developing a fair, transparent hiring process and ensuring that everyone in charge of hiring follows it. On the path to rebuilding, it's easy to default back to the standard approach because it feels known and comfortable. Changemakers working to implement Native nation rebuilding can draw upon their community's inherent strengths to overcome the standard approach and design a future that reflects Indigenous innovation and wisdom. To learn more about Native nation rebuilding and how to get started, visit nativegov.org.
All right, so that's just kind of a quick overview of kind of what we spent our time together, excuse me, last time going over. And so I just wanted to kind of check in. We asked you all to do some reflecting and journaling since our last workshop about these principles. So do folks have any additional questions about nation rebuilding, or are there other examples you thought about that you see nation rebuilding in Lower Brule, or maybe opportunities to expand on nation rebuilding? So I'll just pause and see if anyone has any thoughts to share.
Don't know what answer I want. My questions to the first one: what thoughts or questions do you have about nation rebuilding? Has any tribe that has taken this native rebuilding training or native governance training, has any of them ever asked you to curtail it or tweak it to more fit their constitution or policies and procedures that their tribe follows?
Mm. Yeah, so we do try to kind of tweak. Wait, maybe could you ask your question in a different way? I want to make sure I answer it, what you're
Has
asking.
any tribe ever asked you to more or less design the native governance training just specifically around their tribal constitution, bylaws, or their way of structure, how they operate their structured government?
Yeah, so we hope to kind of do a little bit of that today. We won't go in super detail, but we do try to customize it as much as we can. So sometimes in the nations we've worked with previously, instead of us doing most of the presentations for today, we have some other folks come in from the departments to kind of provide an overview. We decided at the end of our last workshop together, you guys didn't want to go that route, so we'll do our best to kind of go over some of the language in your constitution today.
The second one, any additional examples of nation rebuilding we see in Lower Brule? We do have a group that has started constitutional committee reform, I believe 2 years ago, maybe 3, at least 2 for sure. So there's an example of that. You know, I got so far in chapter 5 last night on my readings, and it did talk about constitutional reform in there. You know, that's one of the steps to rebuilding your nation or whatever. So that I can say for sure that one has started in rebuilding our community. Nothing has been finalized or adopted yet from it. You know, they give a bunch of recommendations or their things, but you know, the reality of it is it's not a whole community involvement. And it's only a handful of people, or I think one survey was at 40 or 20 that ever did that survey. I want to say 40 some. So 40 some is far from the number of tribal members we have living on a reservation to really get an accurate how would you say that, an accurate consensus of the people's wishes on the constitutional reform, because it does go back to referendum vote that the people will be deciding that, not the tribal council.
Yep.
Are there opportunities for more nation rebuild, more Brule? I'd always say sure, and I think the BIA needs some nation rebuilding. Honestly, they're really failing us. We're being failed as a small tribe. I couldn't imagine the level that the larger tribes are experiencing as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, that's for sure. I think as far as the comment on the BIA, it's pretty hard to like decolonize the colonizers, you know? And so kind of thinking of ways to kind of build yourselves alongside so you don't have to be underneath so much, which is some of the things we'll cover today. But that's really exciting to hear that there has been some work towards constitutional change. That committee is a really huge one, and something we'll talk a lot about today is that community engagement piece really is the biggest part of your constitutional change. Like you said, you have to bring that vote to the community. And so getting your quorums, you know, you have to have at least 30% of your community turn out. That can be a really big challenge. And so we'll show you some examples and give you some case studies of different nations who have successfully amended their constitution by focusing on that community engagement piece. Any other questions or thoughts about nation rebuilding before we go into today's content? Well, quiet bunch today. Hopefully you'll become less shy throughout the day as we have in our other workshops. Yeah, yeah, load up those coffee cups for sure. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Michelle to give a brief overview of federal Indian policy.
All right. Well, going to get exciting now. We are going to go over a very brief overview of federal Indian policy. Now, keep in mind, this is only going to be about 15 minutes to cover several hundred years. So it will be a very high level overview, but important to think about how Indigenous nations were prior to contact. You know, we had our own governance systems, our own leadership practices, and the impact of colonization is reflected here in this, again, very high level historical timeline. Most of the time when we're talking about federal Indian laws and policies, the timeline is broken up into these different periods and eras that you see on the screen. There is a little discrepancy on when specific dates start, but these are typically the eras that are most spoken about. I did also want to let you know we have ordered you a much more detailed timeline than here. It's a big poster you can hang up in your office or wherever you'd like, so you can continue to refer to that, and you'll be getting that in the next few weeks. All right, so going right into it, starting on the left of the timeline, first we have the colonial period. This is the 1770s and beyond. And so the first agents of the US government traveled through Lower Brule lands in 1804. It didn't take much longer, and then in 1825, the US government signed the Fort Lookout Treaty with several bands of Lakota, Yankton at Fort Lookout. This treaty said that the tribes agreed to reside within the territorial limits of the US, acknowledge their supremacy, and claim the protection. So this is really the start of setting limits on Lower Brule territory. Moving into the next era, we have the removal area, and one big policy from this time frame is the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This act authorized President Jackson to give land west of the Mississippi in exchange for Indian lands within existing state borders within the Southeast. While this specific act was more for some of the southern tribes and on the East Coast, it did set the precedent for removing Indigenous folks from our homelands. And this became a pattern that you'll see throughout the rest of history. So this next era that we have here is the reservation era. And of course, the first notable treaty of this era includes the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, which ceded homelands, but also protected the right to live, hunt, and fish on ceded land. It also, again, set specific boundaries as territory limits for the Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Crow, Assiniboine, Mandan, and Arikara nations. In 1865, the Fort Sully Treaty established the Lower Brule Sioux Reservation that covered your main settlement area at the time. But then we saw in 1868, the second Fort Laramie Treaty, which created a territory for all of the Lakota tribes encompassed in the Great Sioux Reservation. This happened without acknowledging the 1865 treaty and encompassed all of the lands from the south boundary of Dakota Territory, west from the east bank of the Missouri River to the west side of the Black Hills, and north to the present day boundary of North and South Dakota. This treaty also included the important statement, the United States now solemnly agrees that no persons shall ever be permitted to pass over, settle upon, or reside in the territory. However, we saw just in 1874, a U.S. Army expedition led by General Custer entered the Black Hills and discovered gold, and settlers flooded the region, violating the terms of the treaty. In 1876, the tribes defeated General Custer and his 7th Cavalry at the Battle of Greasy Grass. But following that, we see in this next section of the timeline is allotment and the assimilation era, which is also known as Kill the Indian, Save the Man era. In theory, this was seen as a progressive stance, where the US government policy was moving from total genocide to assimilation. However, tactics of genocide still persisted and were evident in the rider attached to the 1876 Indian Appropriations Act, which was passed in retribution for the Battle of Greasy Grass that cut off all rations for Lakotas unless they ended hostilities and ceded the Black Hills. In the 1877 Many-Penny Agreement, the tribes were forced to agree to the Act of February 2nd, 1877, which officially removed the Black Hills from the Great Sioux Reservation, which of course we know is a major violation of the treaty and is still debated today. In 1880, the Railroad Right-of-Way Agreement was established. The Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railway Company negotiated with Lower Brule for the lands that they wanted for a depot to support the new section of railroad running from the west side of the Missouri River at Chamberlain. The tribe had no choice, and with this, the 1880 Railroad Agreement lost 640 acres of prime settlement lands. Next was the 1887 Allotment Act, also known as the Dow's Act. Here we see the breaking up of Indigenous held land. Some of this land was given to Indigenous folks, but only if we agreed to use the land in a way that the government wanted to become farmers. trying to give a different way of life to Indigenous more in one place rather than our more traditional ways of existing, which included more movement across the land. This also made it so that any surplus land would be made available to whites. So this meant that by 1932, just 50 years later, white folks had acquired 2/3 of the land that Indigenous people had held in 1887. The 1889 Act of March 2nd split the Sakonju into two. The Rosebud Reservation was established south of the White River, and the Lower Brule Sioux Reservation was moved north. The following year, on March 3rd, another agreement was forced on Lower Brule relating to tribal members who continued to resist their removal to the reservation north of Fort Lookout. The Act of March 3rd made these tribal members and their families members of the Rosebud Reservation and also transferred their rights to Lower Brule Trust Land. This reduced the Lower Brule Reservation by 120,000 acres. Then in 1906, the Act of April 21st allowed the US government to take over 56,000 acres of allotted lands in the Stanley County portion of the reservation and provide them to non-Indian homesteaders. Most of this land is now part of the Fort Pierre National Grassland, and the legality of this takeover is still disputed. The Act of May 8th, the Burke Act, allowed the Secretary of the Interior to convert an Indian allotment, which could not be bought or sold, to fee land, even without the permission of the allottee. This continued to erode Lower Brule land as tribal members were forced to sell their allotments to non-Indian ranchers and farmers. And this next era, we see the Indian Reorganization Act getting into the 1930s. This Indian Reorganization Act was also known as the IRA. Some say the IRA was the federal government's attempt at recognizing Indigenous self-governance. However, this act didn't really take into account that Indigenous governance practices were already in place, that we already had our own. Instead, it placed a Western-style cookie-cutter template of a constitution on us, almost like Mad Libs, where folks were asked to fill in their tribe's name and location. And it made it seem like our Indigenous nations were all the same, which of course ignores the unique governance practices and structures that we had in place. These IRA template constitutions also made for a lot of oversight by the BIA. A lot of our contemporary tribal constitutions that we see today still retain this template from the 1934 Act. The next era that we see is the termination era. The 1944 Pick-Sloan Act authorized the construction of dams on the Missouri River during this era. One of the notable programs during this time was also the Urban Relocation Program in 1952. It moved Indigenous peoples from their reservations to urban areas like Los Angeles, Denver, Chicago, Cleveland, Salt Lake City, Dallas, Oakland, and Minneapolis, with the promise of good jobs and a better life in the city. But the reality was there was little to no support, and it was just another effort to separate our communities and disrupt our relationships with our homelands. Resolution 108 was passed in 1953, which gave this era its name, as it called for the termination at the earliest possible time of American Indian tribes in California, Florida, New York, and Texas, as well as specific termination of other tribes in other states, including the Flathead Tribe, the Klamath Tribe of Oregon, Menominee Tribe of Wisconsin, Potawatomi Tribe of Kansas, and Nebraska, and those members of the Chippewa tribe who were on the Turtle Mountain Reservation in North Dakota. In 1953, we also saw the passage of Public Law 280. Public Law 280 gives states complete jurisdiction over criminal offenses and civil cases arising on most Indian reservations within California, Minnesota, Nebraska, Oregon, and Wisconsin. And we can see direct connections between the passage of Public Law 280 and some of the MMIW crises that are occurring today. In 1954 and 1962, we saw the Fort Randall Taking Act and the Big Bend Taking Act. These acts took away the bottomland of the Missouri River Valley, over 22,000 acres of prime, rich floodplains and terraces. 69% of reservation families were forced from their homes. Miles of roads, housing, farm and ranch buildings, and many ancestral ceremonial areas were flooded or destroyed. The last era they say that we're in is a really big turn. This is the self-determination and self-governance era. You'll notice this is in the 1960s. We'll think about what is happening in the US at this time is generally the civil rights movement. Anyone outside Indian country doesn't necessarily realize that this was a big civil rights movement for our folks as well. Advocacy groups really fought to put our issues up to the forefront, and as a result, we see a lot of these acts that are still in effect today. The Indian Civil Rights Act, the Indian Self-Determination Act, the Indian Child Welfare Act, the Indian Religious Freedom Act, and the Tribal Self-Governance Act were all passed during this time. A lot of them are still being challenged. For example, of course, we saw the Indian Child Welfare Act going to the Supreme Court. This is something that's really important and shows that we need to take our sovereignty into our own hands and continue advocating and keeping tabs on what is going on in the federal government. Because if we don't know what's going on, these things can be reversed. Lower Brule Sioux Tribe entered the self-governance program in 1966, right at the beginning of the self-governance era in 1996. And in 1999, Cheyenne River, Lower Brule, and the state of South Dakota passed the Terrestrial Wildlife Habitat Restoration Bill, which returned 7,000 acres, what was left of the dry lands along the shorelines of Lake Sharp and Lake Francis Case that the U.S. took from Lower Brule when it authorized the dams on the Missouri River in 1944. And based on kind of the land growth that you all have seen, you're continuing to get lands back held into Lower Brule title, which is really exciting. But when we see this whole historical context, the whole timeline, we can really connect the current situations of our communities to the trauma that has happened over these years. When we think back to workshop 1 about Indigenous leadership, we talked about the characteristics of traditional and pre-colonial governments. And we also talked about how Western Eurocentric worldviews are so different from Indigenous worldviews. Because of these differences, these structures that we were handed by the US federal government will really never work for us. There will also always be some sort of cultural mismatch or misunderstanding. Our people have experienced so much at the hands of the United States government, and all of this is under this intentional policy goal of eliminating us, removing us from our lands, and really eliminating our way of life. So again, when we consider the historical timeline, the current situation of our community starts to make a lot more sense. Reflecting back on workshop 1, we discussed those characteristics of pre-colonial governance, and then thinking about our kind of traditional governance and Western Eurocentric differences, the structures that were handed to us by the US federal government just will never work. And so thinking about the IRA, we'll be diving into your constitution and constitutional reform later today. So we were thinking about how we could utilize those examples from other nations to support maybe potential change that you are interested in. But of course, in a lot of our communities, when we're thinking about community engagement, we also see the long-term impacts of unhealed trauma, of poverty, of dependency, of ineffective governance structures and processes. But one thing that is and was so beautiful about our cultures were that within our practices, beliefs, and traditions, we have a lot of tools that help us navigate through life. We have ceremonies that help us cope and heal from hard things, not just since contact, but before contact, just the usual things that you experience as human beings. So by drastically changing our way of life, and at the same time, the federal government worked to make our coping mechanisms, like our ceremonies, illegal, this has had a devastating impact among our people. The reason it's important to understand this historical timeline and these policies is to understand that all of this is not our fault. Our communities don't experience these really hard things that we've talked about because of anything that has to do with us. When the colonizers came here, all they really wanted was our land, which we've seen over and over with the various policies. They thought it was their birthright to claim and tame the land, and we were in their way trying to teach them, trying to be good relatives, trying to let them know that it's not the land that needs to be tamed, but it's greed that needs to be tamed. We can all live together, but they did not see that as an option. All of these devastating policy choices were simply to take our land, and not because of who we are as human beings or the way that we lived. So it's really important, and now is the time to use that history and how those policies were developed to understand how we got here and to look at the future to learn how we're going to thrive. We don't learn these things to dwell on them. We really learn things so that we know what we're not going to go back to. This doesn't always mean we're able to go back to how things were before contact. We know our world is so different than it was at that time, and our governance structures have always been designed to address the specific issues that we're facing as a community. So how do we change this? How do we want to move forward towards self-determination and practicing true sovereignty? And one way that Native nations have done this is by using constitutions as a tool and a strategy to re-indigenize our governmental practices. This is what we'll be focusing on today, and how we can use our structures and re-indigenize our structures to work for us and for your people. Okay. We just did a quick overview of the last couple of 100 years. I don't know if folks wanted to share anything about what was just discussed, or if Michaela, if you wanted to jump in and add anything at this moment.
Yeah, just again, I'd be curious to see if there's any comments or maybe even like stories that you all have heard of these from these different times.
I have a request, is that a question?
Yeah.
That history timeline that you guys put together,
Mm-hmm.
do you mind emailing us a copy of that?
Yeah, definitely.
They're mailing us one.
Okay.
A poster.
Also, in your, when you were talking about the grasslands up there at Fort Pierre, you mentioned 56,000 acres, is that correct?
Yeah, I believe that's what it said.
See, the council here is working with the grasslands people to get the grasslands back to national forest people, like we explained to you before. In our research and in the Forest Service research, that acreage is between 117,000 and 156,000 acres.
Wow.
There's parts of it that overlap each other, and we're working on that. But where did you get the 56,000?
Actually, from your tribal website. You have a great history on the website that, yeah, that's where that number came from.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Well, thanks for bearing with us. I know it's kind of hard to go through all of that history, both in, unless you're a super policy nerd like myself, it can be kind of dry, but also it's just a hard history to remember and to kind of relive. But it is so important, like Michelle said, to that we're armed with the knowledge of what's happened in the past, not to dwell on it, but just so that we really understand why our communities are the way that we are, why we're structured in certain ways. But also just to know like kind of what we're up against. And so we'll go right into some conversations about your constitution. So again, we have another short little video kind of talking about the purpose of a constitution and how they've been used in Indian country.
One of the points, I'll say it a couple times, I'm sure, this word constitution is kind of a quintessential sort of Western European idea. I learned about it in high school here in Tucson, Arizona, in high school civics. I learned all about the Constitution, right? But many nations in the world don't even have written constitutions, and yet they have constitutions. Fundamental systems of organizing ourselves or any community for making those community decisions that allow us, hopefully, to move toward shared goals. And so I'm going to talk about constitutions in a quite broad way. I'm not talking about it just in the form of my high school civics textbook, but rather much more broadly about the fundamental systems of governing that people adopt. I was teaching last week a session very much like this in El Paso with the Tigua tribe in El Paso, Texas, Isla del Sur. And they're one of the traditional pueblos. They don't have a written constitution. And I posed the question to them, do you have a constitution? And this is all the tribal council and senior managers, and they got in a big argument. No, we don't have a constitution. Yes, we do have a constitution. And what it was about was they eventually said, well, yeah, we have a constitution. We have a very fundamental law of our nation about how we're going to run things. We never have had to write it down because everybody knows it. But we know how we select people who are going to lead. And many nations in the world don't have written constitutions. Very successful places. Israel doesn't have a written constitution. Great Britain doesn't have a written constitution. Navajo Nation doesn't have a written constitution. Fundamental laws are in place, but nothing that you would hold up as the Constitution. So when I'm talking constitutions today, I want you to really recognize we're talking about whether written down, whether embedded in deep traditional culture, whether sitting on somebody's computer or just in ceremony. What we're talking about is the fundamental systems of organizing and governing a self-determined community.
And so, of course, especially with kind of the IRA and colonization, we do have written constitutions now. But this kind of idea of a constitution really was kind of foreign to us prior to colonization. We didn't have any written documents, let alone kind of an organized written way that we would do things. And so when we think about going back to like traditional ways of governance, this is another example of where like, yeah, maybe we might not do things exactly like we did in the 1400s, but we can infuse some of those traditional practices and values and beliefs into our modern day governing context. And so too, before moving forward, like as we're talking about the Constitution, I'm sure you all will maybe notice some changes that you want to make, or maybe there's some things that you don't feel like you're following. That's totally okay. This is really an opportunity to just kind of assess what's working with your Constitution and maybe what's not, and what you might want to change in the future. So going to the next slide, we are going to read the Constitution. So I'm not going to verbatim read. Hopefully you all have done that as tribal leaders, but just kind of go through some highlights based on the things that you all wanted us to cover. So on the next slide is just kind of, oh, you can go one more, just kind of a outline of the different things that are in your Constitution, which is an IRA Constitution. Some of the things that you told us the last time we met that you wanted to learn more about was roles and responsibilities of tribal leaders, your role with local and state governance, your organizational structure, and then also to talk a little bit about the Secretary of Interior approval requirement. And so, of course, whenever we're kind of looking for guidance on how Lower Brule does these things, the first thing we have to do is go to the governing documents. And so in this case, it's your Constitution and your bylaws. So just out of curiosity, raise your hand if you've read your Constitution in the last, say, 2 years. All right, hands going up. All right, how about in the last year? In the last month?
It's more like a reference tool, you know, like
Yeah.
if we something that we have to like address and then kind of go back and see like it's a reference tool to see what the Constitution says and how to make decisions in accordance with the Constitution.
Absolutely. Yeah, and of course, like you as tribal leaders, this is a document you all are referring to every day. If we were to have your program directors or maybe other staff, do you feel that they're maybe reading the Constitution as much, or do you think there'd be a lot less hands?
No, I don't think so.
I think maybe tribal members, directors, maybe, I don't know about non-tribal member directors, but.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so these documents are really important foundational documents, but a lot of times, other than tribal council, they kind of collect dust, and not a lot of our community members read them. You know, when we think about kind of the civics education that we have growing up, we learn a heck of a lot about the United States Constitution, maybe even your state's laws, but we don't really take as much time to learn about our own constitution. And so, you know, one way that you can help folks kind of learn more about these governing docs is to start young, is to have these lessons kind of infused throughout. Your education. And so going on to the next slide, like I said, we kind of went through and tried to highlight the different language that directly relates to some of the questions you all had, talking about roles and responsibilities of tribal leaders. Again, I'm sure this is something, these particular articles are ones that you all refer to a lot. You have Article 3 about the governing body, which basically just says you have to elect officers and hold that list or hold that, sorry, office until the next election. Article 6 really goes into detail with all of your powers of the tribal council. Again, there's a lot here, so I won't read them in detail. And then over to your bylaws. Again, obviously that Article 1, duties of officers, and Article 2, duties of members are going to have really explicit kind of duties for everyone. And then Article 4, again, another one I'm sure you all refer to a lot, is kind of your meeting schedule and how often you're supposed to meet, what quorum looks like, different things like that. And so then you also wanted to know what is, according to your constitution, the role with your local and state governments. And so I highlighted in yellow here every article that has to do with that particular question, which you can see is not any of them. And so this makes a lot of sense in that there isn't a designated role necessarily that Native nations have with states or local governments, but that doesn't mean that you don't engage with these governments as well. And so this kind of speaks to like what that video had to say, where while your constitutions are your foundational documents, they don't always completely encapsulate absolutely everything that you're doing. And so that's why it's important that we have these resolutions, procedures, other things that maybe don't make as much sense to put into your constitution, but we do have kind of described protocols for this. And I would say that while there isn't any express language to what your role is with local and state governments, you as a sovereign nation do have that right and role and responsibility to work with other governments as kind of those equal partners. So working with the state and with the local governments. I know we talked a little bit last time about some of your involvement with the school boards and with the different kind of election commissions in the county. And so that's really great things that you are all doing. As we think about what our Constitution looks like, we need to wrestle with some of these questions about what should be included in these governing documents. You all also wanted to know a little bit about your organizational structure. So again, looking to these governing documents, and there's really not anything, again, expressly written into the Constitution. I highlighted judicial here just because it does, you know, say that you all have a judicial branch. And so in a way that kind of separates, you've got your legislative and your judicial branches. But there wasn't a whole lot about administration. So again, this is maybe something as you're thinking about ways to change and modify your constitution, maybe you do want to kind of list out some sort of structure that you want to have. You know, we've seen some nations with that actually set up a fourth branch of government, all dedicated to oversight, whether that's kind of in an official way or kind of looking at some of our traditional governance where we had our elders and spiritual people kind of as our oversight. So that's kind of the lay of the land for your constitution as it stands. The next thing that you all wanted to know a little bit more about was the Secretary of Interior approval requirement. So what I did was kind of went through the Constitution and I highlighted every single time that said as subject to review by the Secretary of Interior. And you'll see there's quite a bit of yellow or orange highlights here. So in terms of the membership, you all as a sovereign nation get to decide who qualifies as a member of the Lower Brule Sioux Tribe, but that is subject to the Secretary of Interior's approval. So they get to weigh in on who is and isn't a member of the Lower Brule Sioux Tribe. When it comes to the powers of the Tribal Council, there's about 19 different powers listed here, and of those 19, the Secretary can weigh in on 8 of them. So it's delegating, these are your roles, responsibilities as a tribal leader, but it can be kind of removed or taken back by the Secretary of Interior. We then some kind of big ones that stood out there was the section 2 in this powers of the tribal council, which details what the secretarial approval process looks like. So if you have questions, you can look to that to see that exact process. And then section 5 says that the secretary can waive their approval requirement for periods as he in his sole discretion deems fit. And so here we're still setting up this relationship where the Secretary of Interior is the only one who gets to decide when they don't have to approve. And so we really see this in a lot of our IRA constitutions where there's still that kind of patriarchal oversight where the federal government says that, you can have your sovereignty, you can do what you want, but we're still going to make sure that everything's going okay because we know best as the United States federal government. There's also some approval language in the referendum and amendments, of course, because this is about how you change your constitution. So the referendum article describes how to start the constitutional amendment process. So you have to have a petition of at least 50% of your eligible voter signatures, which, as you spoke to earlier, getting survey responses are hard enough, let alone getting 50% of your tribal citizens 18 and older living on the reservation to sign this document. And then, of course, once that is all done, the referendum is finalized, then it goes to the amendment article, which there the Secretary of Interior has to approve your constitutional vote. Then you have to have a vote with at least 30% of your eligible voters participating. So again, a really hard thing to do sometimes to engage our communities. And this isn't engaging communities to vote is a challenge that all governments face. This isn't a uniquely tribal government. I mean, in our couple elections, we've had really low voter turnout rates. So again, this isn't necessarily something that's just a tribal issue, but it does make it really challenging when we're trying to change our constitutions to, again, kind of get out of that BIA oversight a little bit. In the amendment too, it says that no amendment shall become effective until it has been approved by the Secretary of Interior. So again, it's just every time you make a decision, that final stamp of approval has to come from the Secretary of Interior. And in practice, this doesn't often get elevated all the way up to the Secretary of Interior. Usually it goes to like your regional director, and if they want to elevate it up, they can. So that makes things move a little bit faster, but it's still this idea that you have to get approval or permission from a government that isn't the tribal government. So then in your bylaws, there's these duties of officers. So the treasurer here has to provide audits as compelled by the Secretary of Interior. The secretary must provide copies of all minutes to the Secretary of Interior. And these two practices, they're good governance practices. Audits are really great transparency tool for keeping our communities informed. Minutes of meetings, again, another great way to keep our community informed. But the fact that we're compelled to give those to the Secretary of Interior and not to our tribal citizens really shows who this Constitution sets you up to be accountable to. I'm not saying that you shouldn't do audits and you shouldn't have minutes. You should be accountable to your tribal citizens. They're the ones that benefit from this transparency, and we don't need to be kind of that oversight from the Secretary of Interior. And then just the last one that I saw was in the adoption. So again, kind of details the process of adopting these amended constitution and bylaws, which is ultimately subject to approval by the Secretary of Interior. So it's kind of this like chicken or the egg thing when we think about removing this Secretary of Interior approval clause, because it has to be a vote that then has to be approved. So the Secretary has to approve to get themselves removed pretty much. And so, so it's a really challenging challenging process. We'll go through kind of the details and where you can find really the weeds of how to go through that process if you're interested in it. But it is a really challenging process in itself. So, wanted to pause there. Obviously, you all are working in the Constitution all the time. Were there any additional comments or questions you have about the Constitution?
I think one under let's see, back up here, Article 6, Section 1A, to employ legal counsel for the protection and advancements of the rights of the Lower Brule Sioux Tribe and its members, the choice of the council in fixing of fees to be subject to the approval of the Secretary of Interior. Since I've been in office in 2016 when I came on, I'm not aware of the Secretary of Interior having to approve the choice of the council or the fees set forth by the tribe hiring their legal counsel. Also, in talks with our superintendent at the BIA up here, the way he made it sound a few times is that the tribe really needs to look at just taking the Secretary of Interior out of their constitution to approve things. I mean, I always thought it was funny anyway, to assert real true sovereignty, why would you still need the Secretary of Interior? I look at it as maybe it was a fact due to the tribe being a federally recognized tribe and the majority of the tribe's funding coming from the Bureau. But I mean, I think if the fact that the Secretary of Interior really cared about the tribes, they would do more to make sure they uphold their duties and their government offices to provide the services they're supposed to the tribes, like the Bureau of Indian Affairs, to make sure your funding's there on time, making sure those agencies that are supposed to look out for the tribe are doing their job. But it's, like I said, it's nothing personal against them, but it's been a big failure. And I don't really believe the Secretary of Interior really needs to be over the tribes. But that's my opinion. I mean, there needs to be checks and balances. But the majority of tribes coming from the feds anyway, the federal government, and OIG and all that doesn't get it anyway. So I don't know, it's crazy.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think his opinion is representative of about probably the vast majority, over 90% of the Native Americans in the United States. I think another reason why the Secretary of Interior is found in the Constitution is, if you remember, the Constitution was not put together by Indian folks. It was put together by government agents who wanted total control in any way that they can over the Indians. That's, I think that's another reason why the Secretary of Interior is inserted in different parts of the Constitution.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Real quick, sorry to interrupt, because one thing we always go round and around BIA about when we get on them about certain things, they always say, well, it's just usually the tribe. We just do what the tribe tells us to do. So we're telling you to do something, we'll do it then. And, there's like, I don't know if they're passing the buck, so to say, or they don't want to be responsible. So if that's the case, why do we need to report to you? When they say, oh, it goes back to what the tribe wants to do. So it goes back to, what policy is the Bureau following assisting the tribe? Is it tribal policy or the Bureau policy? When we have statements, and I think we've all been in meetings and heard the superintendent say that, well, we do what the tribe wants or what the tribe tells us to do.
It's up to the tribe.
Yeah, so it's like, why do we, what the heck then? It's just really confusing.
That reminds me, that BIA office upstairs, it's upstairs in our building. But what that reminds me of, I heard a guy say this years ago, and I kind of adopted it. He says it's like when the ages were first come onto the reservations, when they started developing the reservation, the agents were sent there to make dang sure the Indian actions were in order. And that's kind of what it is today. The only reason I see why the BIA there is, it's a branch of the federal government to make sure we Indians aren't becoming hostile.
Yeah. They're scouts.
No, right.
Well, and you're exactly right, everything you all are saying, and that's why it's so important to know that really long, sad kind of federal Indian policy, because it really makes a lot of our current situations make sense. You're absolutely right. We did not write this Constitution. Like Michelle said earlier, these IRA constitutions are like a Mad Libs constitution where pretty much everything is filled out already. You're just adding Lower Brule Sioux Tribe everywhere. And so, of course, if they were the ones that made the template during this era where they were trying to kill the Indian, save the man, like, of course they're trying to put as much oversight as possible by the United States federal government. Chairman, you're really kind when you say it's because the Secretary of Interior cares. This particular one might, since we've got Auntie Deb there, but I don't really think that that was kind of the motivation at the beginning of all of this. And so that's why we really have to rethink, like, why are we still using these templates? Are there things that we can change? Of course, the process is, I would say, intentionally made really challenging to change. And then it's additionally frustrating when you have a BIA superintendent who's saying like, oh, well, we just do what the tribe does. Well, that's nice when that's that one individual superintendent's opinion, but that's not codified into law. So they don't have to do that. And that's kind of the thing too with the Secretary of Interior approval. Most of the time, like, the Secretary of Interior is not going to come in with with the like tribal resolution and say like, oh no, you can't do that. But they can, and it's still an option that they can if there was something you did that they really didn't like. And so by removing that, you really are, like you said, asserting that sovereignty to be able to make decisions. But then with that, whenever you have an added right, you have an added responsibility. So then taking on some of those roles, taking out the federal government a little bit more, then it's on you as a tribe to create those systems and mechanisms that still provide the oversight, but it's the oversight to your community, not to the federal government.
Is it Michelle?
Michaela.
Okay, I'm sorry. When we went to Rapid in December 21, this is in the post-COVID era, but we still had to wear masks. You remember that little room they all had us in? And they were worried about COVID. Anyway, I got to address the Secretary of Interior, Miss Holland. We also gave her a manila envelope with a packet of information. Very unfortunate, it's 2 years gone by, not one email, not one letter, ever replying to our concerns. It was really, I hate to say it this way, a dog and pony show, more or less. And when I start hitting the nail on the head on a lot of subjects, she looked away from me, like I pissed her off or something. And that wasn't my intention. It's just like, when you have the highest officials from the DC office and the Great Plains area, you're going to sit there and more or less tell the truth or reference to things that are really crucial and important to Indian country. And it's very unfortunate. She more or less turned away from me and was looking around the room instead of paying attention to what I was saying. And I wasn't up there trying to look good or sound good. I was up there stating facts.
Right.
The short time is my first term as chairman, but so it's really disheartening when we have Indigenous, Native American representation at the DC level who fail to really hear the Great Plains tribal concerns from the tribal leader. Then they want to have all these consultations. But I wholeheartedly agree with former Chairman Frazier. He said, I'm tired of talking. I want action.
Yeah.
Why do we have to keep going to DC? Why don't they come here? Don't they represent us? The tribes that are struggling financially, then we have to pay thousands of dollars to go out to DC. It just makes no sense. And I want to revert back to something real quick. I'm talking about the Constitution, but this is on page 65, financial or functional overload. And I thought about maybe I was at our first training when I think I brought up the fact that we can't be government leaders. We're more social workers and ATMs and crisis managers. It says functional overload. Tribal governments are often the only institutions within Indian nations that have any resources. One result is a community expectation that these governments and tribal councils in particular will do everything. Doing executive education sessions in recent years, Native Nations Institute facility have informally canvassed tribal counselors asking what they're expected by constituents to do. The range of answers is astonishing. Make laws, run businesses, be the ultimate judge of disputes, fix everything for everybody, protect the nation's future, be the local ATM machine, protect the land, give everyone a job, and more. Expected to be involved in everything. Both councils and tribal administrations are often overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second, the financial dependence on outsiders. This kind of reverts back to the policies set forth by the government on our, whether it be 638 or PL 280. Financial dependence on outsiders. Many tribal governments have become heavily dependent on federal funds for daily operations. As a result, many of their activities are hostage to funding decisions made by non-Indian decision makers who live far away and serve multiple interests. While their operations have to follow guidelines set by outside agencies, this makes it more difficult for tribal governments to pursue tribal priorities, and it is in the opposite of self-determination. So all the funding the tribe gets, it's supposed to be, you know, we're 638 trying to be self-determination, or in, you know, under the Indian Self-Determination Act, but more or less you can't spend a dime without their approval, or it has to, your budget has to be approved under the allowable expenses. So it really takes away the whole fact that you're not really getting to really impose the whole true meaning of Indian self-determination. And I've always said this, the only way for the tribe to succeed in the future, in my eyes, is we have to have another economic revenue source that is non-discretionary, so we can spend it how we see fit to take care of our people and not be under that government red tape to take care of our people. But we should not allow them to do away with those programs either, if that's a trust responsibility. And it's just really sad when I go back a chapter or two reading about the Office of Indian Economic Office. Like, what the heck happened to that? How, where's the data, the studies to say, how has these policies worked for the Great Plains tribes? Why isn't this office doing more to create more economic development on the reservations to help alleviate the poverty issues that continue to plague Indian country? I mean, I told the other chairman in 2020, 21, and even 22, I believe I said, I really see the CARES Act and ARPA as a social experiment by the government to see how we could manage money, to see what we would spend it on, to see if we would really do it, what we needed to do with it to take care of our people. I always tell the council here, when we're done, when ARPA's done, closed out, I want to look back and say, what is still here? Individual assistance monies, while our people, first of all, to the economic impact relief payments, but infrastructure wise, economic wise, what is still here that we have that's going to benefit this tribe for the long run? And how are we moving to enact that and develop that into the best possible situation for the tribe to make economic revenue off of it for our tribe? And like I said, it just really sucks, and excuse my language, the tribes in this state are so hindered. The bar is not fair. I mean, we have to go through first federal approval, state approval. We're the most restricted people on this earth. I can honestly say. I think the aliens up above got more freedom than me. But it's reality. And I said it in Rapid City in that meeting in front of state, tribal, and federal leaders. It's unfortunate Rounds didn't get to stick around. That I said, I'm sorry, your policies just don't work. We need to go back to the drawing board and rewrite it so it works for Indian country and it's more adapted to today's culture and economics. Because if we keep staying in the same way, we're never going to get ahead. And I don't want our people and the future of our people to always be under the government's hand. I want us to be really self-determination and to be able to think and grow and learn and survive for ourselves instead of relying on the government to do it, but not allow them to get out of their trust responsibility that they created on their own. So I just want to share that, you know.
Yeah, no, you speak on so many. Thank you very much. I appreciate the bringing out the book. But no, you're so right, and I think, obviously we need Native representation at every single level, but representation isn't enough when it's just a Indian face on a white man's institution, because that's what we have right now. What we really need to do is an unearthing of these policies that, again, as we went through in the history, were intentionally drafted to keep us under the view and the guise of the federal government. And so, what are things that you can do as a tribe to break out of that? It's removing the Secretary of Interior. It's going into the Office of Self-Governance and becoming part of that program so that you're kind of given those more banded funds, that you're not so reliant on the BIA. Again, keeping in mind those trust obligations are really important, and we need to hold the federal government, but we have to look at how can we still get the benefits of the intent and spirit of those federal treaty obligations in a way that's actually helping, in a way that actually supports and provides opportunities for our people, because the current system as it's designed, like you said, it doesn't fit. We get folks in like Auntie Deb Holland who understand our issues that we think, but then once they get in that position, their job is still to defend the issues and policies of the department. It's just inherent. You can't decolonize a colonial system. And so working on ways to get around it, to not be under that approval, is so important. And so I want to transition a little bit into now thinking. So we've talked about your constitution. I'd love to talk a little bit more about your tribal administration. And so, Chairman, you talked a lot about how council is expected to be social workers. You're expected to do this and that and that. And one really great way to kind of delegate some of those responsibilities away from council and in a more systemic kind of approachable way is through your tribal administration. And so first, just wanted to kind of talk through how you all organize yourselves and kind of what your thoughts are around that. So Michelle will kind of write your answers to these questions on the screen. But my first question is, how many programs or departments, I'm not sure what you all refer to them as, do you have at Lower Brule? And it's okay if you have to name them and count them off.
I believe it's 26.
Yeah.
No, it's 26, 27.
26 or 27.
And
Okay.
the majority of them are federally funded.
Okay. So 26 to 27 departments. And could you talk a little bit about like what that structure is? Like who do they report to and how does that all work?
They're under the direction of the tribal manager, and then the tribal manager reports to the tribal council.
Okay. So the tribal manager is the only one that you all as council have a direct report? So that person's kind of the intermediary?
Some of them send their reports to the council too, but that's the chain of command is like he's their supervisor, so they need to go to him with something to follow that chain of command.
Each program has a director too, though, as well. So then the director is kind of the head of the program, and the director's under the tribal manager.
Oh, okay. Well, that makes a lot of sense. And so then thinking about those programs, like obviously, especially if a lot of them are BIA funded, they're all pretty specific in what they can and can't do, how they can spend their money, how they can spend their time. But do you know how the programs, communicate with each other or maybe collaborate when it makes sense?
Yeah, we slacked out, but we used to have a situation where the tribal manager would have a directors meeting. How often was it? Like once a month?
It used to be once a month.
I think
The way they do it now is they have interagency
yeah.
that they kind of work with each other.
That's more like broad though, like tribe. That
Yeah.
doesn't only include just the
Yeah.
programs.
Yeah. So anyway, these director meetings, that's when the tribal manager lets the directors know some new trends or some new directives that are coming out from the tribal council or the government. So it's a good communication effort. We just need to get back into it.
Mm-hmm.
And we will.
When I first took over as chairman in 2020, I set up a meeting with all tribal program directors and tribal employees separately. And, kind of explain, hey, thank you for what you're doing. We're the new council here. We're here to work with you, but we're also going to hold you responsible and accountable. And if you're doing I told them this, and I still say this to this day, if you're doing your job, you're doing what you're supposed to do, you should have nothing to worry about. If you're not doing your job, you're doing something you shouldn't be doing, then you should be worried. And the fact that I expected them to follow their programs, operations, what they're supposed to be doing, do their reporting, making sure they're providing the services they're supposed to be. And then I called in the employees of those programs separately, and I asked them if they have any issues with programs or directors, whatever, to speak now, and don't worry about repercussions, because what they said in the meeting would stay in the meeting. And I think I might have did the same thing with the directors too, but nobody would speak up. Because I said, we can't help you if we don't know about it. And if you're too scared to go to your director or whatever, but I said, there has to be that communication thing. So I set the tone when I took over in 2020 as the chairman of the tribe, that this is the way it's going to be. That we expect you to be there. So we all work for the people. That's the most important thing. And you're paid to do a job. We expect you to be here, and I expect you to get it done and to provide those services to the people. I think, touch back on what the vice chairman said. I can't say we really slacked. I think it's the three we've been through. This is our third tribal manager in 3-4 years, maybe.
Oh, wow.
So the turnover ratio for the tribal manager position, I think, has had a lot of effect. Each one is different in the sense of how they manage or direct. I know I get on ours all the time about not having directors meetings. I said, how can you discipline or say what needs to be said if you don't meet with them? And I know he's doing EDA and transit too, but it's still no excuse, because that is your job. And but a lot of these longtime program directors have been here long enough, they know what they are supposed to be doing. And we as a council should not have to remind them how to do their jobs, or that they should be doing their jobs. So that's one thing that really grinds my gears, in a sense, the fact that, because the council's not calling me in, they must think I'm doing okay. No, that's not the case. We're just busy. We have called in a few programs, but I wanted to call on every one. I wanted a status report. I want to know, how's it going? How's your funding? How's your employees doing? Are you meeting your program goals and objectives? That's the most important thing. And it goes back to oversight. We have a few applicants right now for we're advertising again for the tribal manager position. And that's what we need is a strong, solid tribal manager that's gonna lay down the law, really stick with it on their program directors, but also that job is so broad, because you're almost like a council member in a sense, because a lot of things are delegated off to the tribal manager, business, different things that the tribe is working on, land. I mean, there's so many things. So it's so broad, and I wish we had more money, because you almost need a tribal manager and
Your
assistant tribal
sound
manager.
cut off. I'm not sure if you can hear me.
No, but yeah, we can hear you, but
okay, it just came back.
But I don't know how many tribes have a tribal manager, and I didn't like it at first when I first come on the council, because I was like, why do we need a tribal manager? But then the farther I went along in my career here, I understood it, because of the fact that when the council has to make a decision, it's deemed political, even if it's not.
Right.
So by having the tribal manager to be more or less the sheriff of your programs is a big help, because of the fact it ain't political. It's somebody to impose tribal policies and procedures, and minus the politics, if you want to say that, get involved with decisions. And I have to make hard decisions as a chairman, and I always tell them I have to be fair and unbiased, whether it's my relative, family, friend, it does not matter. So and it's tough, a lot of tough cases, and it's just part of policy, and it's part of tribal government. Like I said, if what that book said hit the nail on the head, and I said it before I even read it, is if we could just be truly what we are elected to be, I think we could be so much farther ahead in tackling so much more issues. But like I said, our people deserve that help. And our tribe's been in crisis mode for many years. There's many things that affect our people that we have to address every day, especially financial. And so it does hinder us from our jobs. So I guess I'd never,
Absolutely.
and I've met a lot of chairmen and tribes in my short 7 years in tribal politics, but I think there's a big consensus. We all go through the same things. Exactly
Absolutely.
what I said. So.
Yeah, well, and a lot of the issues you're talking about in the example that we'll share later today are some ideas to kind of spread out that so it's not all just one person like your tribal manager that has to have all these reports, but also so it allows you as a council to focus on policy, which is what a council is for, and then your tribal staff, your tribal administration, that's the implementation of that policy. You all need the time and space to think big, to do visionary kind of thinking, and you can't do that if you're also doing the implementation of the policies that you're doing. So you talked a little bit about how they communicate with each other. Sounds like they don't necessarily communicate with council. How do you engage the community, or how does the community get input in your government administration?
We have recently got up and running. It's been a few years though. I think you said like 2018 we started the society care. But just recently, um, this we started the society care meetings where they meet once a month, which is basically the Wednesday after our council meetings. The society care is mandatory attendance for a lot of the directors. I think for all the directors, um, they have mandatory attendance where they're there. You know, we have people bring things to the table. The directors bring things to the table, address different things. All of the directors are there to kind of share what they can do, or how they can contribute, or say what direction to go and that kind of thing. We just
Mhm.
recently started being heavily involved with society care, and kind of like this course too. We're really really busy, but I'm really glad that we are making time to do this, because this is
Mhm.
something that is done. I mean, it's perfect timing, I would say, and how we're addressing these issues, going from standard approach to now the decision making and all that stuff. So with society care, we're trying to, by it being a mandatory attendance with the directors, I think that is a good thing, because it's getting us, and then the community kind of goes to all these different programs for all this help, or where they can go, or so now we're trying to work together to say, okay, if this isn't the right place to go, then we can reach out and go to this other program or whatever, and community knows that we're actually addressing them instead of saying, oh no, we can't help you, and instead of just telling them no and sending them out the door, well, this is where we can get you some help. And but then
Mhm.
a lot of it is getting them to their self-help. I mean, we can help you so far, but you got to be willing to put in some work and effort too.
This council had to make,
Absolutely.
thank you for that. This council had to make a tough decision last year. What was it this year? I'm sorry. We had to let a couple tribal member staff go.
Mm.
It was unfunded positions, and nothing personal against them. They were not doing really anything, contributing back like every employee of this tribe. And it was really hard because it got, they tried to say it was political, but it was no. If we're going to be following rules and institute policy and procedures, then we have to be fair to everybody.
Mhm.
We
Mhm.
had to let a former vice chairman of the tribe go, and a former administrative assistant who was a relative to a former chairman.
Mhm.
And that was really caused a lot of hardship. I still
Mhm.
think about it every day.
Mhm.
But that's part of decision making as leaders. You have to do what's in
Absolutely.
the best interest of your tribe, because we set the tone.
Mhm.
And by what we allow or what we don't allow to happen within our tribe, within our tribal administration, and especially the employees. Because when you live
Right.
in a small town, you work in a small place, people talk,
Yep.
and it ruins that climate. And
Mhm.
it's really hard. Like I
Mhm.
said, we didn't do it to try to get back at people or hurt their career or their finances or cause financial hardships on them. It was a hard decision to make. and we caught a lot of flack for it. And I still think about it. Like I said, it's happened close to over a year now, maybe. I don't know, but it's making decisions like that that are unpopular with your people.
Right.
But at the same time, we're trying to show people that we're not messing around. We're here to do a job. If you're not doing what you should be doing, you should be worried. And you can
Absolutely.
only warn somebody so many times. And nobody's above the law, including the tribal council or any employee or program. And so it was really hard. And when we talk about administration, I always say this: we're a team. Whether we like each other or not, we should be here for the one same common goal: to serve our people, to provide the services we're supposed to be providing. And the reality is, we can't solve every problem, especially our people's. We didn't cause poverty. We didn't cause homelessness. We didn't cause the housing crisis. We didn't cause the poverty, but yet you, as an elected leader, are put in these positions hoping, going back to referencing to that paragraph I referenced in the book, to fix everything. And we can't. But you can work on policies and programs to help try to alleviate some of those issues. And because the terms here are so short, you have constant turnover. It's a relearning every 2 years. So it's really hard to foster development and consistency, implementing programs and rules and policy changes and ideas and learning and growing pains of tribal government, of how to best serve your people. I was reading something in a book about when there's inconsistency because of the constant turnover every 2 years in offices, it really strains tribal government from implementing things. But those are decisions that have to be made by the people. And
Right.
I don't know who would want a 4-year term or what, but there has to be something in place where it goes back to rewriting the policy. So it's like your blueprint to success, to reducing poverty, reducing the housing crisis. But it only works if everybody's on the same page. And when you don't have everybody on the same page, and that includes all of our program directors, all the tribal council, the whole tribal administration, and most importantly, the people, it's never going to work.
Absolutely.
It's like banging your head against the wall and asking for a different result, but it's not going to happen. And so trying to explain that to the people, that good things take time, and it's about policy changes, and we need everybody's help, including our peoples, the people that put us in these positions. That statement is no more truer than that, because we need their support to continue doing what we're trying to do.
Absolutely.
And I do give credit to all of our council going back to the 19th. I couldn't even imagine what it was like to be on the council in the 1930s,
Right.
with everything that was happening then, and the steps they had to take so we could be here today and discuss this. I mean, so I go all the way back. I mean, to give credit where credit's due, because they had to face some gigantic hurdles and problems and crises that we'll hopefully never have to experience with less funding and less people to do the job. But somehow they did it, and they survived and brought us to where we are today. So, we're thankful.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think
So,
you speak to a lot of the things. Oh, is that me?
We can hear you.
Okay. Sorry, I know you froze, but I think what you spoke to is a lot of the things that make tribal government so unique and so different than any other government, because not only are you working in these small communities, you're also related to most of the communities. So firing someone isn't just as simple as you didn't do your job. You're firing a cousin, a relative, a family friend, like you said. And so that's why it's even more important to have really great people in these roles of tribal manager, to have these really kind of thorough, uh, systems that make sense so that when you do have to make those hard decisions, it's not personal. We have these policies and procedures that we can point to so that you can see that it isn't personal, this isn't political. But then also like moving some of those roles and responsibilities down to the staff so that you as council, like you said, you're an inherently political entity because you were elected, that even when you're not making political decisions, it can be interpreted as political. So finding ways as much as you can to empower your directors, empower your tribal managers to make some of those more personnel decisions so that you don't have to get in the middle of it as a tribal council. And so again, we'll go through an example that kind of does just that. So are there any other kind of thoughts, comments, maybe ideas that you could tweak your administration to make it, work a little bit better for your community?
I just kind of want to make a generalized comment, kind of what Clyde said. A lot of the things that he is pointing out and a lot of the points that he's making is, if you can recall in the readings, a lot of it is the standard approach. A lot of it is how so that standard approach aspects of it affect on our governing body. And I think that, like I said, this can be more perfect timing for us to be taking this, and I'm glad that we're taking the time to do this because I think we have the right leadership in place right now to be open to this kind of, guidance and stuff. But because the past procedures and how everything was done in the past, we I don't feel like the directors felt the responsibility to fulfill their obligations as directors because a lot of the work was being done for them. I don't, because I just put out something saying, we need to follow the policy about purchases. Okay,
Yeah.
I've gotten responses from some of the directors saying, okay, what's the policy? Or okay, what's the process? And it's like, okay, how are you a director not know that? But
Yeah.
so what I'm saying is that it's been in the past that like we haven't like given them the responsibility to do that, haven't given them the confidence that they can do that. So I think right now, but like I said, with our administration that we have in place now, we're kind of transitioning from that standard approach, and with the short terms that we have, he's very right. Some of our priorities are not to long term or be everything. Like the book is so like I'm enjoying reading the book because a lot of it does pertain to us in the state that we're in now. And so coming more, setting those lines of communication open, being more involved as a governing body and with our administration, I think, and being able to move forward. And yeah, we might not be here in 2 years, we're not, 2 years is a short time, but we have the mindset in this governing body to say, okay, we need to set something in place with the policies, with the projects to be able to prosper, even when we're not here. That's why whenever it says that a council has to be dispensable, it's like, that's so true, like, let's set it in place where we can, the people after us that are being in leadership and carrying on what we're trying to do to make our nation stronger again.
Absolutely. And I think both of you kind of made some really good points about the book, and I'm glad that you're able to find so much value out of it. I think, and Chairman, you said, I knew this before I even read it. The point of the book isn't to, teach you something. It's to give you a framework and validation of what you already know. You already know everything that's in this book that it's going to be telling you, but it's showing you that you're not the only Native nation that is feeling this way, that is experiencing these things, and there are other Native nations that have been in that situation and have been able to move forward because of these principles. So that makes me really excited that you all are doing your readings and enjoying them.
One thing real quick, back to the Constitution stuff, Section 3, I'm trying to find the Article 6, powers of the tribal council. And there's another very crazy thing in there. Section 3 under Article 6, future powers. The Tribal Council of Lower Brule Sioux Reservation, through appropriate amendment of this Constitution, may exercise such further powers as may in the future be delegated to the Tribal Council by the Secretary of Interior or by any other duly authorized official or agency of the government. There goes again is like, oh, we got this great idea, but it's not in the Constitution, it's not in our procedures, so we need to go contact the government to see if we can okay to do it.
Right?
Yeah.
That need to be taken out of the Constitution because that's not really true self-governance. It's not Indian self-determination, and in no way that I know that really benefits the tribe because it's
Right.
saying you think without asking first.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I got another example from you in that Constitution. This is an example of federal government and or Washichu attitudes toward the Indian. Article 3 under the bylaws talks about compensation.
Mm.
It says the officers and members of the tribal council shall serve without compensation. Isn't that something? It's okay for us to get zero, but it's okay. I mean, it's okay for them to get $200,000 a year up in Congress, but we don't get anything.
Absolutely.
But it does say that we, the council, may prescribe for each officer and councilman a stipend for each regular meeting. So maybe we should take all our salaries away, just give $100 a piece to each of us for a meeting.
Yeah. You have a lot
Also,
more meetings, so. But no, that is so important because like when you have an unpaid elected official, what that does is it makes it that only the people who can afford to not have a salary are able to become elected officials, which, isn't reflective of a vast majority of our society in general and is a way to keep kind of the top at the top as well. Yeah.
I would just like to comment on Secretary Treasurer Daly when she stated about how she's realizing that some of our directors, they don't know how to do their reports or something like that. They don't really know. And I hate to say, years ago, we had a leader that served for a lot of years.
Mhm.
And, I really hate to say this, but he kind of did things like he was above the law of the
Mm.
council. And he would, directors would say, I'm a director, but I can't be a director because I'm told to do this. That's not really right. When he wants something done, you do it, and you have to be under him to do it, right or wrong. And so now we're dealing with our directors that um, they actually don't know because they were always directed from above to say, you do this, not this, you do this. They were directed in that way and they couldn't be a director that they wanted to be. And when you first showed how nepotism, you would hire family and not people that are really educated.
Yeah.
I mean,
Mhm.
a lot of our people are smart in a way. We can do it if we really had to, but there's some that you get in a position, they don't know what they're doing, but yet
Mhm.
the leader has put people in there that didn't know what they were doing, and that's why things didn't get done.
Mhm.
And right now, we're trying to help our people realize that we're trying to turn it around and say, hey, let's get people in there that know what they're doing. Let them do their job. Like Chairman says, he wants them to do their job. But for a
Mhm.
lot of years, they've gotten by with um, not taking on that responsibility because the leader would say, you do this, whether they
Mhm.
wanted to or not. They were
Mhm.
directed to do things a certain way. So that's where a lot of our people were hurting
Mhm.
because they were treated that way. And
Mhm.
actually, it happened so long that I had a member come up to me while we were in this part of this council, she said, "Oh, all of a sudden we have to follow the rules." Can
Oh my gosh.
how many years went by that people felt that they really didn't have to follow the rules. They got to do whatever they wanted, have it their way. And like I first said, when we got on, I said, the gravy train is over. This council is not, we're not doing favors. You scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. I mean, I've seen a lot of that throughout the years, and I haven't been the council till this past year. But I've seen a lot of that. And so now our people are hurting because, like he said, we had to let people go because they weren't working, because they were getting these high wages and doing nothing, and they got away with it all these years. So anyway, that's where some of our people are hurting, because they got away with things, and now it's changing, and now they're hurting because they
Yeah. Yeah, it's so sticky kind of untangling that standard approach web, but it's so important to do. And ultimately, once our people understand what we're trying to do, I think there is a lot of respect that comes from the community. It's hard work. It's hard to do since you have such short terms. At 2 years, it's really hard to get a whole lot done, but you can build a foundation in that sense. And I wouldn't consider myself like a super connected Lower Brule tribal citizen, but from what I have heard from folks that I know, like there is a lot of respect for you all in this council, seeing that you are doing things differently. And so even though it can be hard to feel that sitting in your chairs, like just know that I am hearing that from community, that you all are different and that you're really trying to do things differently. And so with that being said, I want to make sure we all give you a good lunch break. We're going to send you off to lunch a little bit early, but we'll ask you to come back a little bit early. When we get back, we're going to dive into how to apply these nation rebuilding principles to your tribal government, to tribal administration, hopefully address some of these issues that you're talking, and then we're going to go through quite a few case studies just to show you nations who have done similar work. So, any questions before we send you off for lunch?
Thank you guys for your time, and we'll eat fast the best we can.
Sounds good. So if I could get you back maybe like 12:20-ish, maybe as close to that as we can, that'd be great.
Thank you.
All right. So with that being said, I know we're not totally convened, but I do want to make sure we don't hold you guys here too long after we said we'd let you go. So we're going to go ahead and get started with our next section, where we'll have Michelle talk a little bit more about these rebuilding principles. But first we have a video to play.
Here at the Native Governance Center, we talk a lot about governance. For starters, it's in our name, and we center our work on helping Native nations strengthen their governance systems. Why specifically are we so focused on governance, and why is strong governance important? Let's begin with a few definitions. We see Indigenous governance as the structures and processes Native nations use to promote the physical, cultural, and spiritual well-being of all relatives. When we say relatives, we include not only our living community members, but also our ancestors, future generations, plants, and creatures. To further illustrate the meaning of Indigenous governance, let's explore a few examples. Imagine a Native nation working to protect and assert its treaty rights to hunt, fish, and gather on ceded lands. In addition to defending these rights in federal court, the nation regularly creates educational materials for tribal citizens explaining how they can exercise their rights. Here, governance looks like both taking legal action and managing real-world implementation. Now, envision leaders from a Native nation coming together to create an emergency response plan during a global pandemic. Their plan includes processes for testing, contact tracing, stay-at-home orders, road closures, and supply procurement, among others. Rather than a set of static policies, governance is ever-changing and can be used to respond to current and future needs. It's not just elected leaders and governments who participate in governance. Our actions and relationships on an individual, family, and community level also inform how our nation functions. All of us have the responsibility to contribute to governance, whether this looks like educating community members about civics, learning from our elders, stewarding the land and protecting waters for future generations, or participating in other activities that advance collective well-being. Strong governance depends on community participation. Native nations should create ways to involve their citizens in their processes and systems. Community listening sessions, public comment periods, youth and elder councils, and social media campaigns are just a few examples of ways to engage the community around governance. Now that we know what governance is, why does it matter? Well, Native nations with strong governance systems are more likely to thrive into the future than those without. Let's unpack that a bit. Native nations are sovereign, independent nations. They're able to design and implement governance systems that align with their culture and values. Due to ongoing impacts of colonization, some Native nations are still operating with governance frameworks they did not choose for themselves. Many of these nations are in the process of rebuilding their governance systems to better align with their needs and vision for the future. The link between strong governance and a nation's overall success is well studied. Researchers at the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development analyzed a huge volume of data and case studies, eventually pinpointing 5 specific factors that lead to Native nations thriving on their own terms. Strong governing systems is one of these factors. Strong Indigenous governance looks like strategic thinking that ensures the health and well-being of future generations. For instance, a nation may decide to enact water quality standards to help guarantee the long-term survival of Minoman. Strong Indigenous governance can also look like visionary leaders rallying the public around land return and collaborating with state and local governments to make it happen. These are just a few examples of the many ways Native nations are using governance to create the future they want to see. All of us have a role to play in strengthening Indigenous governance. Whether it's serving as an elected leader, providing feedback on a proposed policy as a community member, or taking action as an ally to help support tribal sovereignty, governance is a collective effort that has the power to improve quality of life. To learn more, visit nativegov.org.
Awesome. Okay. So from that video, we saw the role that everyone can take in playing and helping in your nation's governance. So now we're going to think about applying those 5 Native Nation rebuilding principles to really strengthening and improving your tribal governance through your tribal administration. If you have your Native Nation rebuilding handout, feel free to refer to that as we dive into ways to strengthen your administration. So first, going back to the principle of transformational leadership, a few ways to apply this principle in tribal administration is to really think about the recruitment, hiring, and maintaining of staff who aren't only capable of doing the job, but are motivated and excited to do the work. This requires building a positive work environment where folks feel supported, encouraged, and not just with salaries, but with professional development, mentorship, and opportunities for growth. We know vacancies are a common thing in Indian country, and it is a challenge to recruit and bring people in to do the work. Trying to think outside of the box, how do you hire capable staff? How are they onboarded? And how do you make sure that they're supported in a good way? Really thinking about connecting them in with the networks that you already have, since it sounds like you do have staff who've been around for a while. And then thinking about how you can help folks grow in their positions, to then maintain them and help develop your workforce, which means many times helping your own tribal members grow their skills. This workforce development piece is critical in offering opportunities to build your skill sets and knowledge of your tribal members, which can then lead to further opportunities for your nation and for those that you serve. You can also ask yourselves and your managers, how are you thinking about leadership and mentorship in your roles? And what does that mean to be able to take on leadership roles with your community to really lean into that transformational leadership principle? We've talked a lot about kind of change management, and when newly elected leaders come into office, there can be a change in administrators, or if you have turnover in leadership positions. Sometimes it makes sense for some nations, but in others, it kind of creates instability and can interrupt some of the progress and work that's been done. So thinking about kind of those monthly director meetings you spoke to, how can we stabilize that so your directors who kind of had been doing those monthly meetings regularly can contain and continue those without needing necessarily your tribal manager to lead those. You can think about what kinds of systems and structures you want to set up to maintain your staff, and again, strengthening the stability and institutional knowledge and memory and work that's been done and will continue to be done regardless of who's in those elected or upper level management positions. So then next, thinking about strong governing systems, we want to think about developing systems and processes that build trust with your nation's citizens. We know because of the impact that's happened with our people, the history, the forced assimilation, all of the conflict that's happened in our communities, this has caused a lot of distrust. Of course, that's not at all the fault of the current administration and current elected leaders, but it is something, of course, that we continue to have to address. Being able to build systems and set goals to rebuild that trust with your citizens is really important to demonstrate how expectations can be set and then also met. This also entails that you'll do intentional assessments of what your capacity are within your programs and your government overall prior to taking on any programs or initiatives to see what is covered at the moment and what areas need to be delegated. We know more and more nations are working to take over some of the work that the BIA or IHS has done for them and their nation, which is incredible. However, it's really important to make sure you have the systems in place in your own nation and the capacity of your staff and systems to take on these programs to continue to serve them effectively for your tribal members. So when we're thinking about making sure that your programs and are being communicated effectively, are your programs linked? Are they interconnected? Are there ways that one program could be supporting another? And are there ways that programs could be tag teaming on certain initiatives to help with those different projects to move forward in a good way? You talked a little bit about that in the community of care meetings too, where folks can kind of share barriers that they've addressed, and directors can serve and provide feedback around what programs may address those needs that have come up. So those are just some things to think about in terms of setting up the systems that provide collaboration and that interconnectedness that can also foster a really positive workplace. Again, it was great that you mentioned the value of the directors meetings that used to occur and how those are opportunities for folks to continue to collaborate and not work in those silos. We know it's really common that programs do often work in silos, so people don't necessarily know what's going on in someone else's program, other updates that are occurring across your tribal government and in the federal government, like you mentioned. So it's really exciting to think about how you can communicate that through a variety of methods, whether that's through those monthly directors meetings or email updates that can go out through monthly program updates or newsletters. Really also thinking about a chance for employees and community members to share the priorities that they're facing and any changes that can be occurring in their programs to address specific needs. Thinking about how that information is disseminated to your tribal citizens can be useful, again, through those monthly reports or updates that can happen in meetings or electronically via social media or emailing. We know that the way that you can keep your community members updated can ensure that maybe their questions can get addressed by someone who isn't in your upper level position, but instead by one of those programs that can quickly meet that need, rather than you needing to take that step to refer an individual. In terms of cultural match, we know culture is medicine. Our culture has the medicine, solution, and answers to address the different challenges that we have today. As a sovereign nation, you have the authority to design systems and processes that are the most appropriate for your people's needs and interests. So if there's an opportunity to integrate more of your cultural practices and values into your current systems, we definitely encourage that. When thinking about cultural match, the most important thing about cultural match is that your government structures match your political and cultural practices and not another nation's or group of people. Again, going back to developing these systems that work intentionally for your people. Again, cultural match doesn't necessarily mean going back to pre-colonial structures, but means forming a governance structure that works for you and your people moving forward into the next seventh generation. And going on to that seventh generation thinking, again, we're really thinking about being strategic about the future, which is helpful for your administration to be intentional with carrying out and meeting your goals, which again can help develop that trust in your citizens. The decision that you're making today, how that's going to impact future generations, can really impact your ability to move forward and gain that trust. When thinking about administration structure and processes, you want to develop these systems that have long, clear-term goals in mind. Often our nations unfortunately operate in crisis mode, as we've talked about, and we've seen that during the entire pandemic, it can be difficult sometimes to strategize because we need to problem solve in the moment. But where you can really think about restructuring your administration to alleviate some of the responsibilities on your plate and perhaps some of those responsibilities on upper level leadership's plate will allow you all as council leaders to really focus on the policy that Michaela mentioned earlier and thinking more strategically and long term. This might be developing a new strategic plan for your nation. Of course, we know without clarity, a nation's administration can be at risk for lacking direction, which can make it confusing for administrators to know what their goals or priorities should be, or if they're getting mixed messages about which priorities those are. It can also cause administrative programs to move in different directions, and again, can keep administration in crisis mode rather than working towards the long-term vision and hope for your nation. There's an example in the Rebuilding Native Nations book about misalignment. If a nation says our goal is to increase entrepreneurship, to increase the number of Native-led, Native-owned businesses within our nation, but then a citizen wants to go to the business development office or wherever they need to go to register their business for their nation, they can often end up getting stuck in this crazy bureaucratic loophole. So then it says like the citizen feels like their nation is saying they want to prioritize entrepreneurship, but then their systems aren't set up in a way for allowing that to happen effectively. So it's important to make sure there's good alignment between your vision and goals for the future. And then, of course, another part of seventh generation thinking is making sure that there's clear roles and responsibilities, making sure these are really defined, not just for you as council leaders, but for all of your directors and staff. It can really help reduce overlap in duties and also reduce confusion when it comes to knowing who is responsible for what. This can also help reduce conflict and are things to think about as you strengthen your government processes. Lastly, of course, sovereignty. Some ways to do that in restructuring government, administration structure, and constitution reform work. Really thinking about finding ways to diversify funding resources helps with strengthening sovereignty. We know it's not a bad thing that we're receiving funds that are largely from the federal government, as these are funds that the US government is fulfilling their trust responsibilities. However, as we spoke about before, many of these funds are really restrictive. And so organizing your administration in a way that promotes economic development is important to think about, since it helps to have more resources that are unrestricted, which allows you to do more depending on what your goals are, allowing you, again, to decide how you want to do things. So thinking about strategically getting more resources into your community and being able to use it in a way that helps with Native Nation rebuilding. Of course, we know setting up strong financial systems will allow you to utilize your funds in a more effective and efficient way as well. One of the resources that we'll send you all today is a piece on Indigenous financial management. It was something created by Danielle, our Director of Operations and Finance Department here at NGC. We applied the Native Nation rebuilding principles to financial management concepts. And so this research that we'll share afterwards shows how you can think about diversifying funding resources and developing stronger systems within your own nation. We also, has a little side plug here too, but we also have a really incredible tribal finance program that has supported 3 nations, Bois Forte, Cheyenne River, and Yankton Sioux Tribe, in improving their financial systems through a financial assessment, mentorship, trainings, and grant funding to implement the recommendations that they've received through the program. NGC does this in collaboration with our partner, Clifton Larson Allen, and we are recruiting for our next cohort that starts in 2024. So we would be happy to send you more information if you're interested in that tribal finance program as well. Ultimately, strengthening your tribal administration leads to the protection of your tribal sovereignty, as we continue to mention throughout all these workshops. The stronger your governance systems are, whether that be your processes, your laws, your administration, the easier it will be to defend your nation and exercise your sovereignty. Competent governance strategies makes it harder for state and federal governments to challenge your sovereignty, and have your citizens really standing behind all the important work you do for your nation, and your citizens. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Michaela to talk about constitutional reform.
Yeah, so all of these great ideas and principles to apply that Michelle brought up are wonderful. But how do we actually do that? We've got to do this through constitution reform, and it's really long. It's a hard process. Sounds like you all have kind of been in this work. You've had this committee going on, so I'm not telling you anything you don't know. So while it is a challenging journey to revise your constitution, as challenging things are, they can also be really effective at helping you strengthen your governance and protect your sovereignty by going through these difficult processes. And so it's also just really important to think about your constitution more as a living document that can be amended to best fit the evolving changes of our nations. And so when I see a constitution, doesn't matter if it's tribal, state, whatever, and it hasn't been amended in like 50, 60 years, to me, that's an out of touch document because our societies evolve and our founding documents should also evolve with them as well. And so a couple things to think about before we get in the weeds of constitution reform. There's some kind of general questions that the book really thinks are fundamental for you to consider when amending your constitution. So the first question is, who are your citizens? What will the structure of your government be? Is it going to mirror the US or is it going to be something more traditional for your people? What makes the most sense for your community and your context? What powers do you want the government to have? And how will your nation decide its laws, selection of officials, and constitutional changes? And so these are really the foundational questions that a constitution answers. And so as your nation evolves, the answers to these questions will also evolve, but this is always kind of a good baseline to start thinking about when you want to do this constitutional review. So then going into more detail on these questions on the next slide, there's a couple components that you really need to think about when you're strengthening your constitution. So these are related to those fundamental questions we went over. So thinking about identity and citizenship. So thinking about who are your citizens. The first part being identity. So defining the self in self-government is a really important piece of a constitution. And so we usually see this where tribes will put something in the preamble that uses Indigenous language, culture, values, some way just to kind of set that identity right there in your preamble. And then, of course, citizenship is a really big contentious issue in a lot of our tribal constitutions. It can be really controversial due to disagreements about blood quantum. While we did our Native Nations listening tour, we visited with some nations who were quite small, and they were really concerned about their future because of the blood quantum of their membership. They estimated that in 100 years, their tribe would no longer exist. So they really felt the need to make changes to that through their constitution so that they could continue to exist into the future. You need to think about your structure of government. So having that structured government, like we've talked about all day, really allows nations to organize yourselves, protect your values, culture, identity, and defend sovereignty. So usually governments will have 3 areas to focus on. You've got the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. And so there are some nations who are adding in that 4th branch. I kind of previewed that a little bit, focusing on the oversight of government. And so that can look different, whether that's, maybe traditional. I know like up in the Northeast, they had clan mothers that were kind of serve that role of oversight, maybe knowledge keepers in the community, whatever that could look like. Thinking about lawmaking and administration. So the most important thing to consider when thinking about lawmaking and administration is ensuring that whatever your structure may be, that it fits with your people's culture and values and makes the most sense for the needs of your government and nation. Sometimes we can get stuck in doing things in ineffective ways just because we've always done them that way and it can be comfortable. But that isn't usually the best way to operate. So being creative, looking at the issues that you face to getting things done and trying to come up with creative ways around those through your structure can be really helpful. Having really clear dispute resolutions is also really helpful when we're thinking about how to change our constitutions. So constitutions that have clear judicial procedures are really important. If it's a nation that has a judicial branch, it's important that a nation's dispute resolution system is free from politics. So we found that those that are independent from the legislative and executive powers have demonstrated to be most effective when it comes to strengthening economic development. So basically, there's in any government, whether it's tribal or not, there's going to be issues that come arise that are going to have to be adjudicated through your system. And so as much as you can kind of separate your judicial branch away from the other aspects of tribal government and tribal politics, then you can have a system that folks really trust and believe in is just looking to get kind of that fair, unbiased ruling out. And then again, thinking about oversight of government. So politics are present in Indian country. There's no denying it. The common beliefs is that it's not what you know, it's who you know, that leaders only serve their families and friends, etc., etc. So whether or not this is actually happening in your tribal government on a factual basis, there are a lot of people in our community that believe that this is how things operate. And so then when there are examples of this, it just really erodes the validity and legitimacy of our native nations and tribal governments. And so it's really important to consider processes that you have in place that would allow for checks and balances and limit one person from having too much power. So again, really excited about this idea of having this fourth branch of government that solely focuses on oversight. To me, this is something that is really unique to tribal governments that a lot of tribal communities had prior to colonization, had these systems of oversight and kind of those checks and balances. So really important to really gaining that community trust of a tribal government, which is so important to get anything done. So that's kind of general overall thinking about the Constitution reform. You all were also specifically interested in the removal of the Secretary of Interior approval. And so there is actually an established framework to take this out. And it is a result of 3 Native nations who sued the U.S. federal government because there was no action on these constitutional reform documents they sent into the BIA. So there was one nation that waited like years and years and never heard back, one that waited a couple months. Well, the ruling of this lawsuit was in favor of Native nations, and so there is a clear established framework that you can follow to take away this approval clause. So everyone's favorite pastime is probably reading the 25 CFR, but that's where you can find just the really detailed overview of what this process looks like, what the deadlines are, what the documents are. And so I'll spare you from reading that word for word, and we'll send you out the link to this as well so you can look through it yourself. But basically, a secretarial election is not a tribal election, it's actually a federal election. And so there are some special steps that you have to take to register for this federal election. And it has to be a separate election too. It can't be taking place at the same time that you like elect your tribal council or things of that nature. And it's also authorized by the Secretary of Interior, kind of going back to an earlier conversation we had there. And so the really kind of abbreviated version of this process is you submit a request. That request has to have signatures from 50% of the eligible voters on your reservation. So then you have to have the language that you're voting on, and then also a list of every single eligible voter. So once you get that all put together, it is reviewed and approved by the regional director. There's some kind of room for back and forth. Community members can challenge the document that you request, the signatures. That has to be done within a certain amount of days. And so once it's all approved, then you are to establish a secretarial election committee. And so then that committee will kind of take through the rest of the process and hold this election. And so, like I said, this is a super simplified version of the process, and it's really advised to do a lot more than what the bare minimum is that's laid out in these regulations here, especially when it comes to community outreach and education. So, with the time limit, so whenever you start working on your petition of the 50% of voters, you have 180 days from the time that you get the first signature on that petition. And so that really points to the time sensitivity of this. While it does take many, many years to get some of these things to go through, the long thing is getting your community educated, on board, and whatnot. The actual process, once you get things rolling, is about a year. And so a lot of the time requirements are 30 days, 15 days. So a pretty tight turnaround to get some of these documents out to your community. And so that's why it's really important to, prior to taking on the actual paperwork of this, is to really engage your community in exactly what it is you're trying to change, what you need for them, have opportunities for people to ask questions so that whenever you are at the point that you're collecting these signatures, folks are already primed and educated and ready to go and really want this to happen. And so we will send out a link to the Pueblo of Laguna, who was able to remove this approval clause in 2012. Still on their website, they have posted pretty much all of the documents that ended up being created for this process. So that's really helpful that you can look through the different official letters and forms and just kind of see like what it is that this group would have to put together to get this through. And so it is also really important to think about what are some of the implications of removing this Secretary of Interior approval clause. You're still going to be a sovereign nation. You're still going to be a tribe. It's not going to take away any of that. But there are a lot of costs that are associated with elections. And so because the secretarial election and your tribal elections are federal elections, with the approval clause, there is federal funding for kind of this removal of secretary or election. But if it passes and you do end up taking that approval clause out, any further elections that you have to amend your constitution, the tribe will have to pay for itself. And so these are some of the costs and benefits that we need to consider and be really honest with the community. I was listening to kind of a Q&A session of a community member who was really upset that her tribe never really let them know that there was going to be this additional cost if they did take out the interior approval clause. And so, you know, it can seem like a bummer to kind of share some of the downsides of this while you're trying to stir up that excitement for this. But again, it's better that folks go into it kind of knowing what the full consequences possibly are. So then it's up to you as a community to decide, do the benefits outweigh the risks, which would just be the funding, is really all I can see here. And so,
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say, when they started this, I told them council shouldn't be involved in it for the fact that it could be taken as being political or one-sided or made to benefit one side. And I said not to, as if they want to sit in as like a, what do you call, ex officio, but it should be guided by a community group, not by the council, because of the fact, for that matter, they can say, you know, they could take it to court and say, oh, it was one-sided, they were being political to benefit this group of people, and it's not constitutional or whatever it may be. And I also told them to keep it positive anyway. But like I said, they have struggled the last couple of years just trying to get community involvement. I don't know all the answers. They've tried food, different places holding it, and I don't know why they can't get the community to buy into it. Everybody wants change, but they don't want to be part of the change to make it happen. That's the unfortunate reality in tribal government politics. And yeah, the people have to be involved to make it happen. I think they're missing that big concept in that. And I wanted to ask a question when you said have 180 days to what?
So to get your 50%, so you have to get 50% of eligible voters to sign a petition to start this process. And so when you're doing that, you have 180 days from when you get your first signature to collect that 50% of signatures.
Michaela, I just wanted to talk to you about that 50% thing. We've been talking about, we have this constitution committee that's going about this process and stuff. So they have been sending correspondences to the regional director, I think, and they did send a correspondence out to them asking them to clarify that 51%, because in our constitution it says 30. And the letter that they sent out in March of this year says that they discovered that the amendment referenced in this letter for 51% of voter eligibility requirement to amend the Constitution was never held. So therefore, in 1991, the proposed Constitution not in effect, and the threshold needed for a valid secretary election was never increased from 30% to 51%. So what they were working on was getting that language right, because in the Constitution it says that not less than 30% entitled voters shall vote in an election. So that is to Timothy the point. He responded to them with that. And so what they did was, over the years, there's been a number of constitutions kind of flying, floating around out there. There's been some changes to the Constitution that didn't necessarily go through the process that, with the secretary election and stuff. The chairman has a different Constitution than what I received when I became into office. And those both are different than the Constitution that they received from the regional director in March. So,
oh, wow.
So that was the first obstacle that they had to go through, is to make sure that we have the right Constitution that has the right language. And so when you're referring to the 51%, I don't think that's accurate. They kind of got that clarified with the regional director, but we're leaving it in the hands of the Constitution Committee to make sure that all those things are in place. So we are doing the process right. And the main thing that the other obstacle we're going through right now, like he is saying, is the community involvement. So it's taking some time, but I think with it being on the table and us knowing that it needs to happen, that there's a lot of us in the community and the leaders that know that it's going to, we're getting the wheels rolling. It's basically
Yeah.
Real quick, Michelle, Brian needs an answer. Is everybody okay with the education department next week, the 31st, using the chambers? Because they're going to have a PBS, or South Dakota Public Broadcasting, during their meeting.
So we're tied, Feli.
Okay.
I'll run you one. Right. Yep. But,
Yeah.
Continue on.
Go ahead.
Are you done?
Yeah.
Also, Article 6, the adoption under the bylaws. Feli was saying that you're saying it's 50%, and then you're saying it's 30%.
30, yeah.
Okay, so in the adoption, it reads, this amended constitution bylaws attached to it shall be in full force in effect whenever a majority of the adult voters of the Lower Brule Sioux Tribe voting at an election called by the Secretary of the Interior again, in which at least 30% of the eligible voters shall vote. So do we have one part of the Constitution where it says 50% and another part where it says 30, or am I misreading?
So the Constitution, and that's good to know that there's kind of multiple versions floating around there. The Constitution that we're referring to is the one that's on your website. So I don't know which iteration of that one it is. But there is one that says the 50% in the referendum. So that would be Article, oh gosh, I'm really bad with Roman numerals.
Article 7 or Article 8 under referendum. Yep.
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 And so So my understanding is that the petition, so the 50% is for the petition to open up to have an election to begin with. And then the 30% is once that election is approved and you actually hold it, then 30% of those of your eligible voters then participate in that election. That was my
Yeah,
understanding.
Majority of that 30%.
but if you look on the second part, it says, upon the position of at least 50% of the eligible voters of Lower Sioux Tribe as defined in Article 4(5), Section 1, are upon the request of a majority of the tribal council, any enacted or proposed ordinance or resolution of the tribal council shall be submitted to a popular referendum, and the vote of a majority of the qualified voters voting in such a referendum shall be conclusive and binding on the tribal council. So it's saying either 50% of the eligible voters or upon the request of a majority of the tribal council. So to me, I take that as the majority of the council could call for a referendum vote as well.
Mhm.
So it's saying two things in the Constitution that's on the website. I think it was my first term as chairman. I asked the BIA superintendent, which constitution does the BIA recognize for Lower Sioux Tribe? And they said the one on the website, which is, I think that's a different one that Cody's got. Okay. So the when I came in 2016, there's this black one, or the black folder. That's the one they said they recognized. So, you know, and like I said, it's pretty sad. Here we are in 2023, and there's, why is there 3 or 4 different constitutions? I don't know.
That we got.
Yeah.
That's beyond us. Should have been straightened out years before us here.
Yeah, but it's the tribe that needs oversight, right? Not the federal government that has lost all of these versions of the Constitution. Yeah, so absolutely. And I will say, like, NGC does offer support in going through this process. If you really want to dig down into the weeds that we don't have time to do today, through our customized tribal support offerings. And so we can follow up with more information about that if this is something you're interested in. Again, totally recognizing that this is something that's best led by community efforts, which actually leads really nicely into your neighbors across the river. So the Crow Creek Sioux Tribe has actually passed this. So they had a grassroots group with some of their elders, wanted to get the community together. So it actually started by these elders sending out a survey that got more than 300 responses, just asking folks like, what do they want to see in the community, what changes to the Constitution, and overwhelmingly folks really agreed that they wanted to remove this approval clause. And so kind of spurred on that input from that survey, they then traveled out to all the districts, offered food, and really did a lot of work to educate their community about the Constitution and bylaws and the proposed change. And so this happened. We actually learned about this by meeting with Crow Creek in 2020 during our Native Nations listening tour. So I tried to look around on the internet, try to get some more information other than what we heard in the interview, and wasn't really able to. But from the last we spoke to them in 2020, it actually passed their election in 2019, and they were just working on getting it officially adopted into their constitution. And so I know you all are physically very close to Crow Creek, so if you're interested in learning more for them, that might be a good kind of connection point there.
Well, is there a difference too between us and them because of the fact that they went into receivership years ago and they don't even really manage their own federal funds? So is that why too they wanted to expedite the Secretary of Interior out of making or having the final say in something they wanted to do, in a sense, you know what I mean? I don't know. I just think about that from time to time. But I think it goes back to how much is the Bureau, the Department of Interior, Secretary of Interior's office paying attention to tribal needs and things, and how they're written in a lot of tribal constitutions, as it seems like, if we know Crow Creek had it in theirs, that they're holding back a lot of forward progress for tribal nations. And on the Great Plains, I don't know how it is for other tribes, but
Absolutely. Yeah, and so yeah, that's kind of just like in a super simple nutshell about that removal. Again, we'll give you more information so you can read the 25 CFR as your heart is content. The link we sent is to the online version, so I'm sure as you know, the 25 CFR gets updated every year, and so the online version is always going to be the most up-to-date version. So we'll make sure to send that along. But there are, oh, go ahead.
Also, that this is the official website of the Lower Brule Sioux Tribe. So everything on there is factual. So the way I take it, the Constitution that's listed on our official tribal website is the official Constitution of the Lower Brule Sioux Tribe.
Absolutely. Yeah,
That's how
that,
I don't know how
yeah,
I would
for
hope it's
sure. Uh, so
Well,
going into, oh, go ahead.
just a quick thought here. Like Feli was saying, there's different kinds of constitutions floating around. And we don't know, or yes, we do know now. Like the chairman stated, that if on our official site, if the Constitution is on it, that is the one we should be attuned to. But in our Constitution Reform Committee, you remember what's the name wrote to the Secretary of Interior, or wrote to Aberdeen and asked him what is the correct Constitution?
Yeah,
And the Constitution that's on that site is it correct? Or that's the one he said was correct, right?
I think so. I would love to say yes.
I don't know that for sure.
Well, we can ask them. We meet with them next week.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Okay.
It's okay.
I'm sure it is. They want our website,
That's the
right?
website, yep. And then I got your copy and my copy and.
But yeah, we've heard that, there's 2 or 3 and I don't know what the heck happened there. We really miss our tribal attorney to do that research on that. But as far as I know, this is the one I followed since I've been in office. And elected because you're sworn in under that. So I know I've heard the same thing. There's 2 or 3 different ones out there. And I don't know if the Bureau or the Secretary of Interior's office has a copy of all of them. But that's the one that's recognized that's on the tribal website.
Okay. Cool. Well, I want to make sure that we have time to share some examples of another government structure that kind of helps as well. But first, I hope you all will indulge me in us all standing up together. Michelle, if you want to go to the next, not the next slide, but the slide after. There was some requests last time to have you guys get up a little bit. So if I could have everybody stand up.
Where'd you get pictures of me exercising?
I won't tell. And just have everybody, I don't know, you can practice what that cat's doing, do some jumping jacks. You can try those high knees. I don't think I can do that myself, but whenever you feel your blood flowing again, you're welcome to sit back down. But let's give everybody a chance to stand up.
Stand up too fast, right?
Yeah, I can't jump through the screen and catch you, so.
Oh, my granddaughter wanted me to do a cartwheel with her, and I tried, and oh my God, I can't do it anymore.
Yeah, I wouldn't dare ask for that. Wiggling is enough.
Can I ask a question? Back
Yeah.
to let's see which chapter 2, page 36, 4th paragraph down. I kind of highlighted stuff that was
Me too.
struck me. Economic development then is the process by which a community or nation improves its economic ability to sustain its citizens, achieve its socio-cultural goals, and support its sovereignty and governing processes. This definition is a spacious one. It has room for many kinds of activities and for various outcomes. It makes no assumptions about the kinds of economies or communities that Indigenous people develop or about the strategy they use to get there. Real quick, I know I'm going backwards a little bit, but that's when I came across through the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development. And I don't know if you guys have researched this at all to say what has changed or evolved for tribal governments through that Harvard Project on that American Indian economic development, and how has that been changed or tweaked in any shape or way or form to fit the current structure of the government's economy and business practices for economic development on the reservation?
Yeah, so that is a perfect lead into this next section, where this tribe, the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, does have a really cool, innovative way that they've kind of separated their tribal government from their tribal enterprises, created ways for community to give input as well. I will also say, like specifically the Harvard Project, they do like honoring nations every year, so they highlight different nations that are using rebuilding. We'll definitely be sending you a link to that website so you can see from these other nations. But if we could go to the next slide, we have examples of government structure. And so then on the next slide, you'll see this really fun organizational chart. So this is the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. They are located in eastern Oregon, and so they are actually a confederation, as their name suggests, of the Umatilla, the Cayuse, and the Walla Walla. And so to me, it makes sense that they would have so much opportunity for community input, but then also just kind of division of work so that there is opportunity for all of the different bands that are kind of confederated into this one nation to have input and say. And so of all of the employers in Northeastern Oregon, they are actually one of the largest employers. They have some really cool, diverse economic development projects. One that I think is really fascinating, it's called Cayuse Technologies. And so what they do there is they're basically like a big call center. And so they'll get contracts with people like, Amazon or, Verizon, different kind of big companies like that who need people to answer the phone for customer service. And so all the tribe had to do was set up really great internet to go to this Cayuse Technologies. And so now they're able to be a really big call center for various different companies. They've even gotten some government contracts with like the Department of Defense, so that they're able to get some good contract money that way. And so there's a lot of other enterprises that they've been working on that just really have been supporting a lot of their sovereign moves. And so just to kind of go top to bottom through their organizational chart, up at the top they have the General Council, and so this is actually all tribal members who are 18 and older. And so the General Council has a chairman, a vice chair, and a secretary, and an interpreter. So any tribal member can submit an issue for consideration through the General Council. They meet monthly. Before their meetings, they share a meal together. Their meetings contain updates from the chairman, the Board of Trustees, which is like what in Lower Brule context would be their tribal council, and then also working groups. These meetings are also pretty private, so you can't attend them unless you are a tribal member 18 and older, or if you're invited to give a presentation. So I was able to go to one of their general council meetings upon invitation, which was a really cool experience for me personally. And then, okay, going down, you have the tribal court. So you'll notice that the tribal court is actually a little bit off to the side there because they are kind of their own independent, separate branch of government. And so this makes sure that the tribal members have access to justice away from political interference. We then have the Board of Trustees. And so this would be like your version of a tribal council. So they're elected by the General Council every 2 years. They have 9 members. Their main roles are to set policies and priorities for the whole nation, and then also to provide final decisions on tribal affairs. They then, kind of similar to your all's tribal administrator, have an executive director. And so this executive director reports to the board of trustees. Similar to your position, it is a professional, so a not elected position. And really their main role is to implement the things that the board of trustees passes. They also provide management and oversight for all aspects of tribal government and administration. And so you'll actually notice they have the executive director, but then they also have deputy executive directors too. So then that executive director's job can be a little more broad, whereas those deputy executive directors are the ones that are really in the weeds with the different departments and directors. And so then you'll also notice there's kind of on the, what is my left side, so like the blue columns, this is all the tribal government. So it's separate over here. And then over here you have the gray columns. So these are their tribal entities. So these are all their businesses that they operate. And so all of these businesses are actually operated by these different community committees. And so they have different advisory committees, regulatory commissions, and board of directors that are all tribal citizens. And so this is a really cool way to involve and empower your community members. And these different committees and boards and commissions actually report directly to the board of trustees, not the executive director. So they're appointed to these different boards and commissions by the board of trustees. And so then that way, without having to have everyone reporting to the board of trustees, there's executive director and then these different commissions, so that the board of trustees is still getting that information from the community and from what's happening in the government without having absolutely everybody coming to them. So the advisory committees, so these committees are set to provide policy advice to the board of trustees, and also educate outside groups about policy in their area. So, tribal council members, you're expected to legislate and make decisions on pretty much every single policy area, and it's absolutely ridiculous to expect you to be a policy expert in every single area that exists. And so these advisory committees are really taking your community members that have this really specialized niche policy education and experience, and able to advise the tribal council, or in Umatilla, the board of trustees, on the best way forward. They are governed by an advisory committee code, which describes their internal procedures. And there's 6 of these committees. So there's cultural resources, economic and community development, education and training, land acquisition, law and order, and then science and technology. So they then have these regulatory commissions. And so these regulatory commissions actually have authority delegated to them by the board of trustees to exercise governmental power in a particular subject area. Again, so these are really specific niche policy areas that maybe the board of trustees themselves don't have that kind of expertise. So we're going to go ahead and appoint folks who have spent their whole life in this particular policy area. We have laws and codes that they have to follow, but ultimately they can make some of these in the weeds decisions. So they are allowed to enact regulations, conduct hearings, issue permits, and impose fines. So they have 7 of these different regulatory commissions. They have their elections, fish and wildlife, gaming, natural resources, taxes, taro, and water. And then they also have these boards of directors. So the boards of directors are the ones who run the tribal enterprises, and also the service agencies of the tribal government. So they function a lot like boards of directors of private companies or nonprofit groups. So they're kind of in the weeds of the personnel issues. They can hire and fire employees. They create and manage budgets for these different enterprises. They can file contracts in their own name, and they can even file lawsuits. And so this is just what I think is a really innovative way to kind of split up all of the million buckets and hats that tribal council is expected to wear, to also get some expert community input, so that there's this feeling of shared pride and shared work within the government from your community members as well. So go ahead.
What does it say between general council and tribal court? Your picture's like covering the top part there.
There.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. So then that is the Constitution and bylaws.
Okay.
I'm trying to look for the separation of powers.
Mhm.
On the general, on top here, the general council, that would be the executive branch, probably, correct?
So the General Council is actually all of their tribal members. So the executive branch would actually be the Board of Trustees.
So, okay. And your court system, that would be the judicial right here, correct?
Yep, so up there at the top, the tribal court, there would be their judicial.
So how about the legislative? Would they
Um,
take the action like that?
yes. So then the legislative would be the Board of Trustees since they're the ones that set policies.
But that, you said that was executive branch too.
Oh, sorry. Executive, it refers to more of like the organization. So that would be like the executive director, and kind of the more program departments. My apologies there.
We get accused of the same thing. We have the judicial branch is not equal to the executive branch. Therefore, the executive branch can tell the courts what to do, correct? And I don't think it should be like that.
No, we got a separation of powers.
We do.
Yeah, and so here the tribal court is completely separate from the executive branch and the judicial branch, or it is the judicial branch and the legislative branch. So they're able to operate without interference from the board of trustees or the departments as well.
So they don't have tribal council members?
That's what their board of trustees would be.
How many are there?
There's 9.
How many members are in that tribe?
I don't know off the top of my head, but it is a fairly large tribe. They do have a pretty significant casino. So I don't know if you've heard of like Pendleton, Oregon, like the blanket company.
Oh, yeah.
Like they don't own the blanket company, but that's the town that they're in. So there's like the Pendleton Roundup is right over there too. And so they're all involved with that as well. So they're a big casino over there. They have 3,000 members. Thank you, Michelle.
Wow.
Who has 3,000?
3,000.
3,000?
So smaller than us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just wonder, how did they get any business done with everybody being the general counsel, I guess? Sure, you have a lot of different opinions. I mean,
Their board of trustees serves as their business council.
so but they have to take the general councils.
It's just like what we're supposed to initially be, supposed to be with the people.
Yeah.
Give them everything that's coming to the table, let them make a decision, and all we do as the council is supposed to
Ratify it.
So
Yeah,
that
because the
means-
general council does have their own like chairman and vice chair as well. And so they kind of elevate issues through the community through that way and then decide through that chairman what goes to the board of trustees.
Okay, thank you.
So that we're getting close to the end of our day, and so I just want to make sure that we're able to end at a good time. So we're going to go ahead and go into our reflections and wrap up. And so, as always, we like to share some calls to action, something to journal and think about between now and our next time coming together. So we'd all love you all to think about in your role at Lower Brule as a council leader, employee, and community member, what can you do to strengthen governance at Lower Brule? What is your first next step? So as always, it's really important for us to learn what, oh, sorry, we have Nourish Your Mind next. We'll go to the next slide.
So you said council member, employee, and community member, right?
Can you back up?
Oh, yep, sorry. And we'll email this out too. So in your role at Lower Brule as a council leader, employee, and community member, what can you do to strengthen governance at Lower Brule? What's your first next step?
I think probably in the area of communication, get these directors meetings going again.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's probably a lesser item, but I think that's very important for us to do that. You know, there's gotta be communication throughout the tribe within these entities. They need to know which is going on with each other.
Absolutely.
But you know, as we were talking, it's up to the tribal council to get things going in the community. You know, we're the leaders. The people vote us in for leadership roles and to set examples, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
I think it may be a universal problem amongst tribes, but like the richer tribes, like the Seminoles, the Shakopee, and the tribes out there in California, they have these. They have a lot of money, so they get paid a lot to sit on the councils. I don't exactly know how much it is, but I hear it's quite a bit. And then here in the Midwest and other portions where the tribes aren't real wealthy, they get paid by the hour. And I think there's a lot of tribal council members who I think across the nation that could be doing a lot better by attendance at the tribal offices more. I did a little bit of a workup while we were talking, or I did it before, but I brought it out. I don't know how much tribes get per hour, but let's just take a council member or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 who don't come in for a couple hours a day. Well, let's say they get $40 an hour. So you take that 40 times 2, and that's 80 hours of work or a disservice or working for nothing. It gets more interesting. You take that $80 a day times 10, which is 2 weeks, that comes out to $800 that each of us are doing a disservice to the people. So you take that 800 times 26 pay periods, and that comes up to $20,800 that we are doing a disservice. Not only us, but people all over the. And then you take that times 6 council members, that comes out to $124,800 for a year. So $124,800 of disservice to our people. You take that times 2 years, which is a term, it comes up to $249,600, almost $500,000. So if you take, if council members are taking more than 2 hours off, like 3 or 4, that increases dramatically. So if you do 2 terms times 6 council members, that's $1 million in 4 years that we're doing a disservice to our people. That's not a good way to look at it, and it makes us feel guilty because, you know, we should be there doing something for the people after all they voted us in. But I think, I really do think that if we would, not only we, but council members all over would spend more time doing things for the people that they, and that's the reason why they voted us, I think we would see a significant difference, an increase in attitudes. The more you work, you know, the more money you receive. And I mean that by, you know, if we were here together all the time, like, and same with other tribes, we could talk about how to raise more revenue. So
Mhm.
having said that, you know, I'm guilty too. So, but I think that's one of the main things that I think tribes can do to create a healthy tribal work environment or a healthy tribe.
Mm. Oh my. Well, thank you for that. So we talked a lot today about we'll send you this, we'll send you that. So we've got a really long list of Nourish Your Mind resources that we're going to send you all. We'll have some handouts, some links. I promise to overwhelm you with all of the hyperlinks and resources we send you. Just know there won't be a quiz on all of them. We just really wanted to give you guys as many resources as we could to wade through as you would like. I would love for you all to read chapters 4 and 6 in the Rebuilding Native Nations book. So this just goes even more into detail in the role of constitutions and getting things done for your nation. We'll also be sending out some case studies about different government reform issues. And so before I let you guys go and ask you to take the survey, I did just want to take a couple minutes to talk about the action planning portion of this program. So you all are doing the 4-part workshop series right now, but we also have a second part of this Indigenous Leaders in Governance program, which is around action planning and really helping to support institutional change at Lower Brule. So initially, our idea for this program was that we would help you all develop an onboarding process so that whenever there's new tribal leaders coming in, they can, get up to date on the Constitution, kind of following a similar format to what we have presented to you all in these 4 workshops. But if that doesn't sound like something you all are interested in, we're also open to kind of any other initiative that you all would like to see. And this is really just coming from, a comment that someone made earlier of like, we're tired of talking about these issues. Like, what are we doing to actually make change? And so that's what this action planning is meant to do. So we can either, I know we don't have much time today, but if you wanted to identify a project or initiative right now, we can, or we can do that otherwise. But this is going to be 3 days in total. We would come in person. We do about 2 days of workshopping with the action planning. So that would be creating roles and due dates and a budget and kind of all of that. It's about 3 hours per session per day. And then we'd also be there kind of an extra day, either on the front or back end, just to kind of support or either prepare you all for this, wrap up, kind of use that extra day in whatever way you all think best. So we would provide, as we do all of our programs, our facilitation for free. We'd provide all of our facilitation supplies as well. We would just ask you all to provide the meeting space and also any food or refreshments that you would like. So I guess my first question is like, do you guys want to go forward with this action planning? And if so, could we maybe set some dates?
I'm trying to look at my calendar right now. Because it's so far out.
Okay. Did you get that paper I gave you?
So that would be the Monday
Yep, I got it.
after Thanksgiving, correct?
Correct. And we'd only need 3 days, so it wouldn't be like that whole week, just kind of 3 consecutive days in that week.
Well, yeah, that would probably be the day to do it because the following week we'd have our council meeting on December 6th.
Mm.
Have you ever thought of taking a course like this and offer college credit for it?
I mean, I don't know if I'm a college professor, but um, I mean, at NGC, our goal is to work with tribal councils, but
It's called the Native Rebuilders Program. so people can, what is it? I remember the ages on the program, but you can apply and go through the program in a cohort. And I know some of our employees have done it in the past. Some of our tribal members.
You get good college credit.
No, you don't get college credit for it. You just go through the program as just like we're doing. We're not getting credit for it, but we're getting the information from the program.
Any of your classes similar to this that you took?
Well, I did mine on public administration, but some just kind of like structure wise. Some of it was.
This good information.
It is.
This question I have is for you is basically be what, I know this is just basically done for us right now, but what other trainings do you guys provide for community members to enlighten? The same type of enlightenment you're doing with us.
Yeah.
Because in the end, it's not about promoting ourselves, it's about empowering the other people that may come into these positions to have a better understanding of what's in place. Instead of reinventing the wheel, they're getting it going.
Repair the old wheel.
Yeah, so we do have a couple of programs that Michelle and I do. So obviously this is our Indigenous Leaders in Governance. We have done this before where we've done council and department directors all in the same training, just to kind of expand beyond council. We also do have a tribal civics project where we work with a group of community members to help create a civics initiative in your community. We leave it kind of broad so that the community group itself can decide exactly what that initiative looks like, but we kind of walk them through some steps in decision making that way. And then we do, Michelle spoke a little bit about it, but we have our tribal finance program as well. And so that is for elected leaders, so like your treasurer, and then your finance staff to go through a 2-year program where we do a deep dive into your finances. We learn from you about things you would like to work on. We spend about 2 years doing in-person and virtual convenings. You have a mentor through that program, and then we also provide some grant funds to address something that comes up in your assessment. So that's kind of overall a really quick pitch of our other programs that we offer, if that answers your question.
Okay. I mean, because that's basically in the end, that would be the goal of, as you said, in the formal things that came up was that transformational leadership would be about empowering our community members to get some type of training like this, so they have a better understanding to the dynamics that are faced upon many leaders and roles that come into these positions, that they have an understanding of where the timelines are.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Absolutely.
This is probably absurd, but I'd like to see this course be mandated by council members.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. Whoever gets on council has to go through this course here. It's a good fundamental base.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it brings out a lot of it. I could even see it. You know, I sit on a college board of directors. I could even see this class going into a college for a tribal government class also.
I can tell you right now, they say that's unconstitutional. It's not in the Constitution.
We'll read it to you.
No, I agree. I mean, I just want to say I'm thankful to my colleagues here, the council, for willing to take this training, because in all, whether it be in tribal government or not, it's going to make you a better leader in whatever career choice field you choose to stay in or go in. It would make you a better person. You always have this knowledge and training. You know, like we were taught, never stop learning. And the jobs we are in are the hardest jobs on the reservation, because you have almost 4,500 people depending on you, and we're not God. We're servants of God, but you know, only He can make those changes needed within our community. But it's given us the strength to come to work and with a good mind and a good heart, and to agree to disagree, to agree to do what's best for our people. So I think that's the most important thing, and I thank my colleagues for taking this training, and I think that everybody's gonna have to check their schedules because it's so far out, so it's hard to commit to that timeline right
The
now.
only problem I have is county commission at Tuesdays in the morning.
On that November 27th to 28th then?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and we can shuffle around. I mean, even if we do like, maybe a day, if we have to break because someone has something a day, we can stay that extra day as well. And so too, to your point of you wish that every council had to go through this, like that is an initiative we can help you all action plan if you wanted to create some sort of training like this that you all can implement yourself.
What I can say is the council can do a resolution recommending. As far as directing is gonna be the tough part, because any council that comes in could just say, well, we're on doing that resolution, we don't have time. You know what I mean?
Can I say recommend it as a
strong recommendation.
Orientation.
Yeah, so, but before we go, Louis, you wanna say a closing prayer for us? Put you on the spot, Lou.
Yeah, I know.
Auntie said to tell Louis to pray.
Yeah.
Pray to the Tate Atopa, and all within the Makasi Tome, as we pray for these relatives who shared this wisdom with us, and it enlightens our relatives here, that gives us that hope that we can find a way to strengthen our leadership, but also strengthen our community. I also pray for that Wichos on you, that strength and that courage, and perseverance and fortitude, especially the humility, just to have the better understanding and the woke up they needed to go forward in these decision makings. Woke to you for this training, and woke to my relatives, especially all of this community that is in need of
Oh, thank you.
Exactly. All right, well, thanks everyone. You're not quite done with us yet. We've got one more workshop on federal and state relations. So we've confirmed the executive director for the National Congress of American Indians will be coming in to speak. And then we've also secured the Secretary of Tribal Relations, David Flute, to come in and speak as well. So have your questions ready, and we're excited to see you.
Cody said, what about Auntie Deb?
We tried.
Also, even if you could have got Wheezy Pong or what's the other guy's name? See his face, long hair, ponytail. He's assistant secretary to Holland. Brian Newland.
Mm.
If you can get a chance to get him on for a short 10, 15.
We'll keep working our magic, but I can't promise anything.
Well, thank you. Just tell him, say, Chairman Estes told me to reach out to you and ask you. Say he's still waiting for those things he's asked you about 2 years ago, but he's got faith in you.
Well, we'll try. In the meantime, we'll send you all out the email. We'll send this kind of survey too. If you don't have time to take it now, that's fine. But otherwise, we'll catch you in about a month.
All right, okay, be safe.